Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. Growing up, I always thought the stories about our family's old cabin were just that, stories. My grandfather loved telling us tales about the cabin up in the mountains, passed down through generations. He'd talk about its original owner, a reclusive man who supposedly went mad and disappeared one winter, leaving the place abandoned until my great-grandparents bought it. The only thing he left behind was the mirror, Grandpa would say with a wink. The one that can't be moved. It sounded like a silly myth. A mirror that couldn't be moved? As a kid, I'd even tried, putting my little hands on the ornate frame in the main bedroom, but it was as solid as the wall itself. Grandpa would just laugh, saying, "Some things are better left alone." When Grandpa passed away last year, the cabin became mine. I hadn't been there in years, but with everything happening in my life, I needed an escape. A weekend in the mountains sounded perfect, so I packed my things and headed up. The drive was longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense, silent forests. By the time I got there, it was late afternoon, and the place felt frozen in time, exactly as I remembered it. As I stepped inside, memories flooded back. Summer nights with fireflies, the smell of pine and old wood. Everything looked the same, down to the old rocking chair by the fireplace and the family pictures lining the walls. But when I got to the bedroom with the mirror, I felt a strange twinge of unease. The mirror was still there, of course, tall with an ornate silver frame covered in intricate carvings. It stood against the wall, exactly as it always had. The glass was slightly warped, making reflections look odd and distorted. I laughed it off, chalking it up to old glass, but there was something unsettling about it. It didn't just reflect. It seemed to draw you in, like it wanted you to look closer. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some dinner, and sat outside under the stars, letting the quiet wash over me. But when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The mirror loomed in the corner, reflecting the dim light from the fire. I turned away from it, trying to sleep, but every creak of the old cabin set my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping. I sat up, listening. It was coming from the bedroom. I grabbed my flashlight, my heart pounding, and slowly made my way to the door. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I pushed the door open and the beam of my flashlight swept the room. Nothing. But the tapping persisted. It was coming from the mirror. I took a step closer and the tapping stopped. I stared at my reflection, my heart in my throat. The room behind me was empty, just as it should be. But then I noticed it. Something off. A tiny movement, a flicker in the corner of the mirror, like a shadow darting out of sight. I whipped around, shining the light in every corner, but there was nothing. Just the empty room and the soft crackle of the dying fire. I turned back to the mirror, peering closely. The glass seemed darker somehow, the reflection murkier, like looking into deep water. Then I saw it. A figure standing just behind me, barely visible, more shadow than form. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, but again, there was nothing there. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But as I turned to leave, the tapping started again, louder this time. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost like a knock. I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me. I didn't sleep much after that, lying on the couch in the living room, every creak of the cabin sending a fresh wave of unease through me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I tried to ignore the mirror, focusing on fixing up the cabin. I spent the morning chopping wood and cleaning out the old shed, trying to keep busy. but every time I passed the bedroom, I felt the pull of the mirror, like it was daring me to look. I resisted until nightfall, when curiosity got the better of me. Armed with a fresh resolve, I decided to confront my fear. I marched into the bedroom and stood in front of the mirror, staring hard at my reflection. I raised my hand, half expecting something to mimic my movements, but my reflection was normal. I laughed at myself, relieved, but just as I turned to leave, the mirror went dark. My reflection vanished, replaced by a black swirling void. I stepped back, my heart racing, and then I saw him. A figure slowly emerging from the darkness, his features distorted like a warped painting. His eyes were hollow, empty voids, and he was smiling. A slow, twisted smile that didn't belong on any human face. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the bed. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, reaching a hand toward the glass. I scrambled to my feet and bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear the tapping again, more frantic now, like fingers drumming on the glass. I grabbed my things and left the cabin that night, driving down the mountain as fast as the old road would let me. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me like it could keep whatever was in that mirror away. I called my mom the next day to tell her about the cabin, and she listened patiently as I recounted everything. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she sighed, and I could hear the sadness in her voice. "I should have told you sooner," she said quietly. "That mirror, it's been in the family for a long time. It belonged to the original owner of the cabin. He wasn't well. He believed that mirrors were portals, that they could trap souls. That's why it can't be moved. It's bound to the cabin, to him." I didn't want to believe it, but the fear in her voice was real. She said that my grandfather had always refused to talk about it, claiming it was just an old superstition. But the mirror had a way of holding on to things, echoes, memories, maybe even more. I've never gone back to the cabin, and I don't think I ever will. But every once in a while, I dream of that mirror. In my dreams, I'm standing in front of it, watching as the figure slowly emerges from the darkness. And no matter how fast I run, I can always hear the tapping following me, growing louder, like fingers drumming on glass. Sometimes in the stillness of my apartment, I'll catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker in the reflection of my TV screen, or the faint sound of tapping just beyond hearing. I tell myself it's nothing, just old fears resurfacing. But deep down, I know the truth. Some things are better left alone, and some mirrors reflect more than just your face. I've always been a fan of old houses, the kind with creaky floors, hidden rooms, and a history that seeps from the walls. So when I found a listing for a century-old Victorian house at a ridiculously low price, I couldn't resist. The place was a fixer-upper, sure, but I was up for the challenge. I figured it would be an adventure, a chance to bring a forgotten beauty back to life. The first few weeks were normal, full of dust, old paint, and the occasional surprise of finding something cool in the attic or basement. It wasn't until I decided to tackle the attic that things started to get strange. The attic was a dusty, claustrophobic space with a sloped ceiling and tiny, cobweb-covered windows. The only light came from a single, dim bulb that flickered like it was on its last leg. I was rummaging through old boxes, finding nothing but moth-eaten clothes and rusted trinkets, when I found it. A small wooden box, tucked away in the darkest corner. It was locked, but the wood was so old and brittle that it crumbled under a little pressure. Inside, there were only a few items. A faded photograph of a family from the early 1900s, a small doll with one missing eye, and a journal with brittle, yellowed pages. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started flipping through the journal. It was filled with the usual entries, day-to-day life, chores, and notes about the weather. But then the tone changed. The writing became erratic. Sentences trailed off, and some pages were smeared with something dark. There were mentions of the silent one, and how they could feel its eyes on them even when they were alone. I shrugged it off as the ramblings of someone long gone, maybe a resident who had lost their grip on reality. But as I put the box away, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The family in the photograph was staring straight ahead except for one, a little girl with hollow eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. I set the photo down, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I heard noises from the attic. Faint, almost imperceptible at first. A soft scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe some raccoons that had found their way in. But as the nights went on, the noises grew louder. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, pacing back and forth above my bedroom. One night I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs to the attic. The air was heavy and cold, almost suffocating. I swung the flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place, just the same old boxes and forgotten relics. The pacing had stopped the moment I opened the door, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for any sound. Then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. But this time they were closer, like they were right above me, moving in a slow, methodical circle. The next day I decided to do some research on the house. I found out that it had belonged to a family called the Halvorsons. They had lived there for generations until the last of the line, a little girl named Emily, died under mysterious circumstances. The details were vague, but rumors hinted at a tragic accident. Some said she fell down the stairs. Others claimed she was pushed. That night I went back to the attic, determined to find something that would explain the noises. I searched every corner, every crevice, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Frustrated, I turned to leave when I noticed the doll from the box lying in the middle of the floor, even though I was sure I'd left it inside the box. Its one eye seemed to glint in the dim light, and for a moment, I thought I saw it move. I quickly shoved the doll back into the box and made my way downstairs, my heart racing. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a faint giggle, a child's laugh that sent chills down my spine. I spun around, but the attic door swung shut with a loud bang. I didn't sleep at all that night. The footsteps continued, but now there were whispers too. Soft, almost melodic, like a lullaby. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there, just on the edge of hearing. I tried to tell myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, that I was just overtired. But the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. The next day I decided to seal the attic shut. I nailed the door closed and shoved a heavy dresser in front of it for good measure. For a while it seemed to work. The house was quiet again, and I started to feel like maybe I was in control. But then things got worse. Objects began to move on their own. Nothing dramatic at first, just little things. A book that I knew I'd left on the table would be on the floor. Doors that I'd closed would be open. Then the whispers started to follow me around the house. I'd hear them in the kitchen, in the living room, even in the shower. And every time I passed the attic, the air would grow cold, and I'd hear that faint giggle, muffled but unmistakable. I called a friend asking him to stay the night, just to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. He agreed, though he was skeptical. We spent the evening watching TV, drinking beers, and laughing about how ridiculous it all was. But then, around midnight, the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and we both heard it. Footsteps above us, slow and deliberate. My friend grabbed a flashlight, his face pale. We stared at each other, neither of us wanting to admit we were scared. Then came the giggle, clear as day, followed by the sound of something scratching against the attic door. We watched in horror as the dresser began to slide across the floor, moving on its own. The door creaked open, the nails I'd hammered in now lying bent and useless on the floor. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief flash we saw her, a little girl, standing at the top of the attic stairs, her face obscured by shadows. But her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared straight at us. She lifted a hand, beckoning, and the giggle turned into a shrill scream that filled the house. We bolted out of there, not stopping until we were outside, gasping for air. My friend refused to go back in, and honestly, I didn't blame him. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. The house still stands, empty and unsold, and sometimes I drive by just to remind myself it was real. But the strangest part? A few weeks after I moved out, I got a call from the realtor. She said the house was boarded up, windows smashed, like someone had tried to keep something in or out. She asked if I knew anything about it, but I just told her it wasn't my problem anymore. I still hear that giggle sometimes in the dead of night, and I always feel those hollow eyes watching, waiting, like she's still up there in the attic, pacing back and forth, never stopping. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to ghosts and the paranormal. Haunted houses, creaky floors, flickering lights. It all seemed like cliches from low-budget horror movies. So when my friend Mike dared me to spend a night in the abandoned St. Helena Asylum, I laughed it off. I only agreed because the place was slated for demolition, and this would be the last chance to see it. It was supposed to be a fun night of urban exploration, a final hurrah for a forgotten building. I brought my camera to document everything, hoping to catch something that would amuse Mike and the rest of our friends. I didn't expect much beyond graffiti and broken windows. I arrived just before sunset, the building looming like a forgotten relic against the twilight sky. The asylum had been closed for decades after a fire had ravaged its east wing. The story said the fire started in the last room on the top floor, where they kept the most dangerous patients. Nobody knew how it started or why the door was locked from the inside. Only one patient was found, burned beyond recognition, though many claimed more had been lost. As I stepped inside, the air was thick with decay and something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. A sort of heaviness. The first floor was what I expected. Peeling paint, broken furniture, an odd rusted gurney here and there. My flashlight cut through the darkness as I moved, revealing rooms that seemed to swallow the light. There were graffiti tags everywhere, names of past explorers, and the usual "help me" scrawled in red paint. It was more pathetic than frightening. It wasn't until I reached the stairs to the second floor that I felt it. The air grew colder, and the silence seemed to deepen, pressing in on me. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the dilapidated structure. Second-floor rooms were lined up like cells, each more deteriorated than the last. My footsteps echoed, muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. Then I found it. The last room. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I paused. For the first time that night, I felt a twinge of hesitation. But the thought of backing out after all the bravado didn't sit well with me. So, I pushed the door open. The room was untouched by graffiti, unlike the others. It was almost pristine, as if the fire hadn't reached it. The only thing inside was a single iron bed frame bolted to the floor and a small barred window. It should have felt like any other room, but there was something profoundly wrong about it. My skin prickled as I stepped inside, my breath fogging in the sudden chill. I turned on my camera, trying to capture the oddity of the room, but the screen flickered, distorting the image. Frustrated, I hit the side of the camera, but it wouldn't focus. It was like the lens refused to see what was inside. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely discernible, like someone murmuring from far away. I whipped around, but I was alone. I moved to the window, peering out, but there was nothing but darkness. The whispering grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. It was as if a dozen voices were speaking over each other, growing in intensity. I backed away from the window, my heart racing, and the room seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The door, which I was sure I had left open, slammed shut with a deafening bang. I rushed to it, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. The whispers were now a roar, unintelligible and angry. I pounded on the door, shouting, but my voice was lost in the cacophony. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness I felt a presence. Cold fingers brushed the back of my neck, and I spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly. There was no one there, just the bed frame, the window, and me. But the whispers were now right in my ear, angry and desperate. I pressed myself against the door, my heart hammering. Suddenly, the flashlight died, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I fumbled with it, cursing under my breath, when the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air like a cold winter night. Then for just a second, the light came back, illuminating the room. And that's when I saw her. A figure burned and charred standing by the window. Her face was twisted in pain, eyes hollow and dark. She reached out, her mouth moving as if to scream, but no sound came out. I blinked and she was gone. But the whispers remained, now pleading, begging. I didn't wait. I threw my shoulder against the door, slamming into it over and over until it finally gave way. I stumbled out, not daring to look back as I raced down the stairs, my footsteps echoing loudly. I burst out into the night, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I never told Mike or anyone else the full story. I just said it was creepy, that there was nothing worth seeing inside. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out. At night, I would hear whispers just on the edge of my hearing, like faint murmurs through a wall. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow, a flicker of something dark. The final twist came weeks later when I reviewed the footage from my camera. I expected static, maybe some blurred shots, but there was one clear image that froze my blood, a photo of me standing in the room, staring at the bed frame, and behind me, clear as day, was the burned figure, her hollow eyes fixed on me. I've never gone back, and I've never told anyone about that photo. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I can still feel those cold fingers brushing the back of my neck, and I know she's still there, waiting in the darkness in the last room, The Crescent View Hotel stood proudly in the heart of the city, a grand, century-old building that boasted elegant architecture and an air of old-world charm. It was the kind of hotel where the lights never flickered, the service was impeccable, and the rooms were always booked by guests who appreciated its timeless appeal. But the Crescent View had a secret, one known only to the staff and whispered among them with nervous glances. Room 616 was cursed. The room was officially closed, its door always locked and bolted. No guest ever stayed there, and the cleaning staff avoided it like the plague. They said it was haunted, but no one could agree on the details. Some claimed it was the spirit of a jilted bride who had thrown herself from the window decades ago. Others spoke of a man who had died mysteriously, found with an expression of sheer terror on his face. Whatever the truth was, no one dared to spend time in room 616, and the hotel management took great care to keep it off the books. Despite the stories, business was booming, and most guests had no reason to question why one room was perpetually unavailable. But one rainy evening, a severe storm caused a flood of unexpected cancellations, leaving the hotel nearly empty. Tom, the night manager, found himself alone at the front desk, sipping coffee and half watching the late-night news. Just before midnight, a man walked in, drenched from the downpour outside. He was an unremarkable figure, middle-aged, wearing a dark coat and carrying a small suitcase. He looked exhausted, his eyes sunken as if he hadn't slept in days. "Good evening," Tom greeted him with a polite smile. "Do you have a reservation?" "No," the man replied, his voice low and tired. "I just need a room for the night." Tom checked the system and noted the abundance of available rooms. "We have plenty of options. How about something on the higher floors with a city view?" The man shook his head. "I'd like room 616. Tom's smile faltered. "I'm sorry, sir. That room isn't available." The man's expression didn't change. He simply stared at Tom, his eyes unblinking. "I've stayed here before. I know it's vacant. Please, I just need room 616. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The man's presence was unsettling, and the way he spoke about room 616 with such familiarity was unnerving. But Tom was bound by the rules. "I really can't do that, sir. Room 616 is closed for maintenance." The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't understand. I have to stay in that room." Tom hesitated, feeling the weight of the man's gaze. He wanted to refuse, to insist on another room, but something about the man's insistence, his desperation, gnawed at him. Against his better judgment, Tom nodded slowly. "Let me see what I can do." He retrieved the key from the locked drawer beneath the desk, its brass tag tarnished with age. Tom felt uneasy, but he handed the key over, the cold metal sending a shiver through his hand. "Thank you," the man said quietly, taking the key. He headed to the elevator without another word, leaving wet footprints on the marble floor. Tom watched him go, unease settling like a stone in his gut. He picked up the phone and called James, the hotel's head of security, explaining the situation. James, familiar with the rumors and wary of any trouble, agreed to keep an eye on room 616 from the security office. Hours passed and the hotel remained eerily quiet. The storm outside intensified, lightning flashing through the lobby windows. Tom couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the lingering wrongness of the night. Around 3 a.m., the lobby phone rang, jolting Tom from his thoughts. It was James. "Tom, you need to come to the security office," James said, his voice tense. "Now." Tom rushed down the corridor to the small room filled with monitors displaying live feeds from the hotel's security cameras. James pointed to the screen showing the hallway outside room 616. The door was ajar, and the dim light from inside cast long, flickering shadows into the hallway. "He's gone inside," James said, his brow furrowed. "But watch this." James rewound the footage, playing back the moment the man had entered room 616. Tom watched as the man stepped into the room, the door closing behind him. A few seconds later, the door swung open again, as if pushed by an unseen force. But there was no sign of the man. The room was empty. "Did he come out?" Tom asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. James shook his head. "No. I've been watching the feed the whole time. He never left, but he's not in there." Tom and James exchanged a nervous glance. They decided to check the room, feeling a mix of fear and duty propelling them forward. Armed with flashlights, they made their way up to the 6th floor, the elevator ride feeling longer than usual. The hallway was cold, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. They approached room 616, the door still ajar as it had been on the monitor. Tom hesitated, then pushed it open fully, shining his flashlight inside. The room was just as it had been left for years, dusty, furniture covered in white sheets, and the unmistakable chill of a place long forgotten. But there was no sign of the man, just an empty room that felt somehow wrong, as if it were holding its breath. "Let's check the bathroom," James suggested, though he sounded unconvinced. They pushed open the bathroom door, revealing a small, dimly lit space. The mirror was fogged over, and water dripped slowly from the faucet, though neither of them had heard it running. Tom's flashlight beam flickered as it scanned the walls, stopping on the bathtub. Inside was the suitcase the man had carried, water pooling around it. Tom approached cautiously, kneeling to open it. As he unzipped the case, a rancid smell filled the room, and Tom recoiled, gagging. Inside were wet clothes, torn and stained with what looked like dark, congealed blood. There was a single damp photograph tucked in the side, a picture of the man standing in the very room they were in, his expression blank and eyes lifeless. James stepped back, his flashlight catching movement in the mirror. For a brief moment they both saw the man's reflection, standing behind them, his eyes sunken and hollow, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The image flickered, then vanished, leaving only the empty room reflected in the glass. They bolted out of room 616, slamming the door behind them and locking it. Back in the security office, they rewound the footage again and again, but the man never appeared on the screen after he entered the room. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist the moment he crossed the threshold. The next morning, Tom and James reported the incident to the hotel manager, who listened with a grim expression. He didn't seem surprised. Instead, he pulled out a file from his desk, a thick folder labeled Room 616. It was filled with reports, testimonies, and old yellowed photographs of previous incidents. Guests who had vanished, staff who had resigned in fear, and sightings of figures that shouldn't have been there. "The Crescent View has its secrets," the manager said quietly, closing the folder. "Room 616 is one of them. We don't open it for anyone, no matter who they claim to be." Tom and James were given strict instructions to ensure Room 616 remained locked indefinitely. They replaced the lock with a reinforced deadbolt and marked it with a warning sign: "Do not enter. Maintenance." No one ever stayed in that room again, and the key was hidden away in the hotel's safe, never to be used. But even after the door was sealed, the staff couldn't shake the feeling that Room 616 was still occupied. Housekeepers would hear faint noises when passing by, soft murmurs, the creak of footsteps, or the slow drip of water. Guests occasionally reported seeing a figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching them before disappearing around the corner. And late at night, when the lobby was empty and the lights dimmed, Tom would sometimes catch a glimpse of the man in the reflection of the front desk's polished surface. Just a flicker of his hollow eyes and twisted smile before fading into the darkness. A reminder that some doors, once opened, never truly close. I never believed in ghosts until I saw one. Growing up, I always brushed off ghost stories as nonsense, just tales people told to scare each other. But all that changed when I moved into the house on Stillwater Lane. It was supposed to be a fresh start. My mother had passed away a few months prior, and I wanted to get away from the memories, the empty house, and the endless condolences from neighbors. The old Victorian on Stillwater seemed perfect, quiet, secluded, and available for an unbelievably low price. I should have known that a house like that, offered for so little, had to have a history. The first time I stepped through the door, I felt it, a chill, like the house itself was breathing cold air into my skin. The realtor explained that the place had been empty for years, ever since the last owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Blackwood, passed away under mysterious circumstances. But that didn't bother me. I wanted a place with character, not some sterile, modern box. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked, set up my things, and settled into my new life. But then, things started to happen. Little things at first. A door left open that I knew I'd closed, lights flickering even though the wiring was supposedly new. I brushed it off as the quirks of an old house. But then came the footsteps. Late at night, when the world was quiet and still, I would hear them, soft, slow, deliberate. They would start in the hallway, moving steadily toward my bedroom. Each night they came a little closer, stopping just outside my door. I would lie there, heart pounding, too afraid to move. I told myself it was the house settling, the wind, anything but what it sounded like. A person, pacing just outside. One night, after a particularly long and stressful day, I'd had enough. I grabbed a flashlight and swung open the door, ready to confront whatever was out there. But the hallway was empty, silent. The footsteps stopped the moment I stepped out, leaving me standing there in the dark, feeling foolish and more than a little unnerved. The footsteps continued night after night, always stopping just outside my door. I tried everything: prayers, salt lines, even a charm from a so-called psychic. But nothing worked. The house remained stubbornly, hauntingly alive. One morning I woke up to find every door in the house wide open, even the ones I kept locked. Every cabinet, every closet, even the cellar door that hadn't been opened in years. I slammed them all shut, one by one, my anger masking my fear. That was when I started to see her. It was always out of the corner of my eye. A figure just beyond the edge of my vision. A shadow that would disappear the moment I turned my head. But I knew it was her. Mrs. Blackwood. I'd seen her face in an old photo the realtor had shown me. pale, gaunt, with eyes like deep wells that never seemed to end. I could feel her watching me, her presence growing stronger every day. I did some digging, desperate to understand what was happening. I went through old newspapers, talked to a few of the older locals, and pieced together a story that was more disturbing than I could have imagined. Mrs. Blackwood was not just some lonely old woman. She had been a recluse, obsessed with dark rituals and the occult. Rumors swirled that she had made contact with something that had driven her mad. They found her dead in the house, but it wasn't a peaceful death. She had clawed at the walls, her fingers broken and bloody, and her eyes wide open, staring at something that wasn't there. The coroner's report said it was a heart attack, but everyone knew there was more to it than that. I should have left then. Every instinct told me to run, to get out before things got worse. But I was stubborn. I refused to be driven out of my own home by a ghost, no matter how terrifying. I decided to confront her, to demand that she leave me alone. I waited until the footsteps started again late one night. I stood in the hallway, flashlight in hand, my heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right in front of me. I shined the light down the hallway, expecting to see her, but there was nothing, just darkness. I called out, my voice trembling, demanding to know why she was haunting me. The house was silent, the air heavy with anticipation, and then I heard it, a faint whisper, like a breath against my ear. She never left. The voice was not Mrs. Blackwood's. It was a child's, soft and mournful. My blood ran cold as I realized there was something else here. Something older and far more dangerous than the spirit of a lonely old woman. That night, I had a dream. A vivid, horrible dream. I was in the house, but it wasn't the same. The walls were stained and crumbling, the air thick with rot. I could hear voices, hundreds of them, all whispering at once, their words overlapping in a terrible, discordant chant. I followed the voices to the cellar, the door hanging open, a foul stench wafting up from below. I descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom, I saw them, figures, dozens of them huddled in the dark. Children, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes wide and empty. Mrs. Blackwood stood among them, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. She lifted a hand, and the children turned to me, their eyes boring into mine. They reached out, their fingers like claws, and I woke up screaming. I left the house the next day. I didn't bother packing. I drove until I reached a cheap motel on the edge of town and checked in, not caring about the cost. I just needed to be away from that place. A few days later, I heard that the house had burned down. A gas leak, they said. No one was hurt, but the house was gone, reduced to a smoldering heap of ashes. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was dread. The dreams didn't stop, and neither did the whispers. They followed me, no matter where I went. I would hear them in the dead of night, faint and far away like a distant echo of that terrible chant. And then one morning I woke up to find every door in my motel room wide open, just like in the house on Stillwater Lane. Every cabinet, every drawer, even the closet. I slammed them shut, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. In the mirror, just for a second, I saw her, Mrs. Blackwood, standing right behind me, her eyes dark and empty, her lips twisted into that same grotesque smile. I ran, I packed up my things and left the motel, driving aimlessly for hours, trying to escape the feeling that I was being followed. But no matter where I go, I can still feel her. In every shadow, in every quiet corner. She's there, watching. And I know now that it wasn't just her haunting that house. It was the children, the ones she never let go of, the ones she trapped in her twisted rituals. And now they're trapped with me, because she never left, and neither will they. It was my first night in the new apartment, a cheap studio on the outskirts of town, far from the noise and the bustle, but close enough for a quick commute to work. It wasn't much, barely more than a dingy box with a bed and a kitchenette, but it was mine. Or so I thought. The place had a certain charm when I first saw it, despite the peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mold lingering in the corners. The landlord, an old man with a stooped back and eyes that never quite met mine, handed over the keys with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just don't be startled if you hear some odd noises," he had said, almost as an afterthought. "Old buildings, you know, they creak and groan." I nodded, not thinking much of it. The rent was cheap, and I was desperate to move out of my parents' basement. Creaking walls were a small price to pay for freedom. That first night I settled into bed, my eyes drifting shut almost immediately. The day had been exhausting, and I barely had the energy to pull the covers up. But as I lay there, in the silence of the unfamiliar room, I heard it, a faint whisper like a breeze rustling through the trees. At first I thought it was just the wind outside, slipping through a crack in the window. But then it grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the walls. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the pipes or the old wood settling. But the whispering continued, soft and insistent. It sounded almost like words, but not quite. Just the suggestion of speech, like someone trying to talk with their mouth taped shut. I strained my ears trying to make out the source. My eyes darted around the room, and that's when I noticed the crack in the wall above my bed. A thin, jagged line that ran from the ceiling down to the floor like a scar on the otherwise plain wall. As I stared at it, the whispering seemed to grow louder, more urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them pressing against my skull like a headache. The air in the room grew thick, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild in the darkness. But sleep wouldn't come. The whispering grew, more frantic, until it felt like the walls themselves were alive, breathing and trembling around me. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, flicked on the light, and grabbed a chair. Standing on it, I reached up to the crack, running my fingers along its rough edges. The whispering grew softer, as if whatever was inside was retreating from my touch. My heart pounded as I leaned closer, pressing my ear against the wall. That's when I heard it clearly, just for a second. A word, distinct and sharp, cutting through the garbled murmurs. "Help." I stumbled back, nearly falling off the chair. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. I stared at the crack, my mind racing. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of trick, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and went back to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear it, that faint, desperate plea. I tossed and turned, the hours dragging by in a blur of restless anxiety. I kept telling myself that I was just tired, that the whispering wasn't real. But deep down I knew something was wrong with this place. The next day I tried to forget about it. I went to work, kept busy, but the memory of that voice clung to me like a shadow. I found myself avoiding my apartment, staying late at the office, wandering aimlessly through the streets. But eventually I had to go back. That night, the whispering returned, louder this time, more insistent. I lay in bed, my body rigid with fear, listening to the words I couldn't quite understand. It was as if the walls were speaking in a language just beyond my comprehension, their voices rising and falling in a haunting, dissonant chorus. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox, dragging the chair back to the wall. I had to know. I had to see what was inside. With trembling hands, I swung the hammer at the crack, chipping away at the plaster. The whispering grew frantic, a cacophony of muffled voices echoing through the room. Piece by piece, the wall crumbled away, revealing a hidden space behind it. A dark, narrow cavity that stretched deep into the building. My heart pounded as I shined my phone's flashlight into the gap, illuminating the dusty void. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes staring back at me from the darkness. sunken, hollow eyes set in a gaunt, pale face. The whispering stopped, replaced by a low, guttural moan. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, and the light flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I scrambled for the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob. I ran out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street, gasping for breath. I called the police, babbling about voices in the walls and a face in the darkness. They arrived, skeptical but willing to humor me, and we went back to the apartment. But when we got there, the crack was gone. The wall was smooth, unbroken, as if it had never been disturbed. The officers searched the place, their flashlights cutting through the shadows, but they found nothing. No hidden space, no body, nothing. They left, muttering about false alarms and overactive imaginations. I stood there staring at the wall, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? The eyes, the whispering. Was it all just a hallucination? I packed my things that night and left, never looking back. I found a new place, far from that cursed building, but the memory of that face haunts me still. Sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I can hear it again, the whispering faint and far away like a voice calling from the walls. And that's when I realize with a sinking dread that the whispering isn't gone. It's just waiting. Waiting for someone else to hear it. Waiting for the next person to come along and listen to the secrets hidden in the walls. But here's the thing. As I'm telling you this now, in the stillness of my new apartment, I can hear it again. It's faint, just a murmur, but it's there. And I know deep down that it's followed me. Whatever was in that wall, it's not confined to one place. It's in the cracks, the corners, the spaces we can't see. It's everywhere. And now it's whispering to you too. It was supposed to be just another business trip. 2 nights in a hotel, a quick presentation, and then back home. I travel often for work, so I'm used to the routine, the long flights, the cab rides, the impersonal hotels. But there was something about this hotel that immediately felt off. The Grand Oak Hotel had seen better days. Once a grand, bustling landmark in the city, it now stood as a relic of a bygone era. The lobby was dimly lit, with faded carpets and peeling wallpaper that gave it a sad, forgotten look. The concierge, an elderly man with hollow eyes, handed me my key card without so much as a smile. "Room 616, he said, his voice dry and raspy. "6th floor, end of the hall." I took the elevator up, the air heavy with the faint scent of mildew. The hallways were long and narrow, dimly lit by flickering lights that buzzed overhead. The numbers on the doors were brass but tarnished, and as I walked I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching me. The floor creaked under my feet, the sound echoing through the empty corridor. Room 616 was at the very end, isolated from the rest of the rooms on the floor. As I approached, I noticed the door looked different from the others. Older, with a different style of handle, like it hadn't been updated in decades. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the keycard reader, but shrugged it off as just my imagination acting up. The room was unremarkable. A standard bed, a small desk, a single window looking out over the city. But the air was stale, and there was a faint, lingering chill that seemed out of place for the warm evening. I tried to adjust the thermostat, but it didn't seem to work. I unpacked my things, took a quick shower, and decided to order room service. When I picked up the phone, though, it was dead. No dial tone, just silence. I tried my cell, but the signal was weak and the call kept dropping. Frustrated, I gave up and decided to head down to the lobby to grab a bite from the cafe. I grabbed my key card, but when I went to open the door, it wouldn't budge. I jiggled the handle, tried the lock, but it was stuck. Panic started to creep in as I tugged harder, but it felt like the door was sealed shut. I stepped back, trying to calm myself. I'd stayed in countless hotels, dealt with finicky locks and weird glitches before. I told myself it was just a malfunction, that I could call the front desk once my phone signal came back. I sat on the bed, staring at the door, the silence in the room pressing in on me. And then I heard it. a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the other side of the wall, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking gently on the other side. I froze, listening intently. Tap, tap, tap. It was steady, almost too steady, like a metronome. I banged on the wall, hoping to get a response from the neighboring room, but the tapping didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the pipes or some old building noise. But as the hours dragged on, the tapping continued, relentless. I turned on the TV to drown it out, but the signal was fuzzy, and every channel showed the same thing, a black screen with static. I turned it off, the room falling back into that oppressive silence. When I tried the door again, it still wouldn't open. I felt trapped, a claustrophobic dread settling over me. I paced the room, the wall seeming to close in. The tapping continued, always just beyond the wall. I shouted, banged on the door, but no one answered. I was alone, cut off from everything. It must have been after midnight when the lights started flickering. They went out completely for a moment, plunging the room into darkness. When they came back on, something was different. The air felt heavier, and there was a faint smell of something rotten like old food or mold. I tried the door one more time, yanking with all my strength, but it wouldn't give. I was stuck. The tapping grew louder, now coming from different parts of the room. It echoed from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, like the room itself was alive. I pressed my ear against the wall, listening. Beneath the tapping, I heard something else, a faint whispering like voices murmuring just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. I backed away, my pulse racing. I grabbed my phone, desperately trying to get a signal, but the screen was blank and the battery drained to 0 in an instant. I cursed, throwing it onto the bed. The lights flickered again, and I saw something move in the corner of my eye, a shadow, quick and fluid, darting across the room. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room, the flickering lights, and the persistent tapping. I started to panic, banging on the door, shouting for help. But the walls seemed to absorb the sound, the noise deadening in the heavy air. I felt dizzy, the room spinning slightly, the shadows growing darker and more pronounced. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed, clutching the key card, staring at the door. The tapping and whispers continued, like a slow, maddening symphony. By the time the first rays of light peeked through the window, I felt like I was losing my mind. I stumbled to the door and tried the handle one last time, and this time it opened easily, swinging wide without resistance. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my bag and bolted down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the lobby. I went straight to the front desk, breathless and pale. The concierge, a different man than the one who'd checked me in, looked at me with a concerned expression. "Is everything all right, sir?" I stammered, trying to explain about the room, the door, the tapping. He frowned, glancing at his computer. "You said you were in room 616? I nodded, my heart still racing. The concierge shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "There is no room 616, he said, turning the screen to show me the layout. The 6th floor ended at room 615. The space where 616 should have been was blank, a gap in the design. I felt my stomach drop, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. "What do you mean? I was just there," I insisted, my voice shaking. He exchanged a look with another staff member, then turned back to me, his expression grave. "Room 616 was sealed off years ago," he explained quietly. "There was an incident. A guest went missing, and when they investigated, they found that the room wasn't supposed to exist. It was like the room had just appeared out of nowhere, and then it didn't. The hotel had it sealed up, but sometimes—" He hesitated, glancing down the hallway. "Sometimes people still end up there." I stood there, stunned, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. It didn't make any sense. I had the key card. I'd been in the room. The concierge handed me a new key card for a different room and apologized, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. I didn't stay another night. I checked out immediately and drove home, trying to leave the whole thing behind me. But the memory of that night stuck with me. The tapping, the whispers, the shadow that moved just out of sight. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear it, that faint rhythmic tapping echoing in my mind. I avoid old hotels now, especially ones with too many floors and not enough answers, because I know that somewhere, in the dim hallways of places like the Grand Oak, there are rooms that shouldn't exist. Rooms that trap you, confuse you, and never quite let you go. Rooms like 616. I've never believed in ghosts. I used to think they were just stories people told to scare each other, but everything changed when I moved into the old house on Oak Street. I should have listened to the neighbors when they warned me about it. They said the place had a dark history, but I just brushed it off as superstitious nonsense. I mean, how bad could it be? From the moment I stepped inside, the house felt off. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. It wasn't the creaking floors or the peeling wallpaper that bothered me. It was the feeling that I was never really alone, but I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was simply not used to the place yet. The first few nights were uneventful. I was busy unpacking, settling in, and getting used to the creaky old house. But then, on the fourth night, I heard it. A faint scratching noise coming from the attic. I dismissed it as rats or maybe some old tree branches brushing against the roof. But the noise persisted, growing louder each night. One evening, I finally decided to investigate, armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, because who wouldn't feel silly with a weapon, right? I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The scratching had stopped by then, leaving only an eerie silence that made my heart race. As I pushed open the creaky door, the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing stacks of old boxes and dust-covered furniture. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. Just as I was about to turn back, something caught my eye. A figure standing in the corner. My breath hitched. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an old coat rack or some other object that looked human-shaped in the dim light. But as I inched closer, the figure moved. It wasn't a coat rack. It was a shadow that didn't belong to anything. It wasn't cast by me, and there was no one else up there. I watched, frozen, as the shadow slowly turned towards me. I couldn't see any features, just darkness. My body felt like it was made of lead, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then the shadow spoke. Its voice was a low whisper, like 100 voices layered on top of each other. "You shouldn't be here." I bolted. I don't remember running down the stairs, but the next thing I knew, I was in my bedroom with the door slammed shut behind me, panting like I'd run a marathon. I convinced myself I was just tired, that it had been some kind of waking nightmare, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoia. I could feel the shadow's presence everywhere, in the corner of my vision, in the reflections of mirrors just beyond every doorway. It was watching me, waiting, and the scratching in the attic never stopped. I tried to leave, to get away from that cursed place, but something always pulled me back. It was as if the house wouldn't let me go. I even started seeing the shadow during the day, flickering in and out of sight like a glitch in reality. One night, desperate for answers, I found myself back in the attic. The shadow was there waiting for me, darker and more solid than before. This time I didn't run. I asked it why it was haunting me, what it wanted. The shadow stepped closer and I could feel the cold radiating off of it. Its voice echoed in my mind. "I was trapped here long ago, just like you." My blood ran cold. I turned to leave, but the attic door was gone. The walls started closing in, and the shadows grew thicker, swallowing the light from my flashlight. I screamed, but no sound came out. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my bed, drenched in sweat. For a moment, I thought it was just another nightmare. But when I looked around, the room was different. Everything was older, dustier. I tried to leave, but the door was locked. The windows wouldn't budge, and that's when I saw it, a new shadow on the wall, mimicking my every move. It was me. I wasn't living in the house anymore. I was haunting it. Sometimes it's not the ghosts that haunt the house, it's the house that haunts the ghosts. If you ever feel like you're not alone, maybe it's because you're not. Maybe you're just another shadow, waiting for someone to take your place. I was never one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. As a real estate agent, I've walked through countless old houses, some dating back to the 1800s, creaking floorboards and all. They never bothered me. But there was something different about the house on Oak Street. It wasn't just old. It felt wrong. It started with a simple call. The owners were desperate to sell. The house had been in their family for generations, but no one wanted to live there anymore. They offered me double my usual rate if I could find a buyer quickly. Money talks, so I agreed without hesitation. When I arrived, the house loomed large and imposing, shrouded in the shadow of ancient oak trees. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, as I approached the front door. The owners handed me the key, their hands trembling slightly. They didn't say much, just muttered something about the forgotten room and quickly left. I shook it off as nerves. Old houses have stories and people get spooked. But as I stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The house was beautifully maintained, yet there was a persistent coldness that seeped into my bones. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like the house was watching me. I started my usual walkthrough, snapping pictures for the listing. The house was stunning, really. Vintage woodwork, stained glass windows, and a grand staircase that spiraled up into darkness. Everything seemed normal until I reached the second floor. That's when I noticed it. A narrow, almost hidden door in the hallway wall, slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the door open to reveal a narrow staircase leading up to an attic. I had seen no mention of an attic in the blueprints, which was odd, but I figured it was just an oversight. I climbed the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. At the top was a small room, dimly lit by a single window. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with old, decaying books and odd trinkets. In the center of the room was an old rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth as if nudged by an invisible hand. I froze, trying to rationalize the movement. Maybe a draft, I told myself, but there were no open windows. Then I noticed the smell, something rancid like rotting meat. It was faint but unmistakable. I covered my nose and turned to leave when I heard it. A soft whisper, so faint I thought I imagined it. But it grew louder, a garbled string of words that sent a shiver through me. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded urgent, angry. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as the whispers grew more insistent. I backed out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and raced down the stairs. As I reached the hallway, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I needed to get out of there. I fumbled with my phone, pulling up the photos I had taken. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In every picture of the house, there was a shadow, a tall, dark figure standing just at the edge of the frame, watching me. But it wasn't in the room when I took the photos. I would have seen it. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. I bolted for the door, not even bothering to lock it behind me. When I got outside, I finally caught my breath. I told the owners I couldn't sell the house and that they should find someone else. They looked at me with knowing eyes and handed me an old, yellowed photograph. It was of the house taken years ago. Standing in front of it was a family, smiling. But in the attic window, there was the same shadowy figure I had seen in the photos. "That's why we want to sell," the owner said quietly. "It's been in the family for generations, but no one ever remembered building that room." I left Oak Street that day, determined never to go back. I still don't know what I encountered in that house, but every now and then, when I'm alone in a new property, I swear I hear those whispers again, faint and distant, like a forgotten memory trying to surface. The house was never sold. It still stands there empty and waiting, and that shadow, it's still watching. I've traveled a lot for work, staying in countless hotels, motels, and inns along the way. I've always enjoyed the anonymity of it, the impersonal nature of hotel rooms, the bland, sterile decor, the sense that you're in a place where thousands of people have passed through and left without leaving a trace. But my last trip changed the way I look at hotels forever. It's the reason I double-check every booking, the reason I always leave the lights on at night. I was in town for a conference, just a quick overnight stay at a high-rise hotel downtown. It wasn't anything special, just one of those big chain hotels with identical rooms on every floor. The kind of place where you forget which city you're in because they all look the same. I checked in late, exhausted from a long day of meetings and travel, and all I wanted was to crash for the night. The front desk clerk handed me my key card with a tired smile and told me I'd be in room 616. I remember thinking it was a strange number, but I was too tired to care. I took the elevator up, the hallway lit by those dim yellow lights that give everything a sickly hue. I found my room, swiped the card, and pushed the door open. The room looked like any other, standard double bed, ugly floral bedspread, a generic painting on the wall. I tossed my bag on the chair, kicked off my shoes, and went to close the curtains. As I did, I thought I saw a flash of movement in the reflection of the window, like someone passing behind me. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. I brushed it off, blaming my fatigue, and closed the curtains. I freshened up, got into bed, and tried to relax, but something felt off. The air was heavy, and there was a faint smell, like dampness mixed with something metallic. I couldn't quite place it, but it was enough to keep me restless. I shrugged it off as a musty air conditioning issue and tried to get comfortable. I turned on the TV to drown out the silence, but the channels were full of static, the images flickering and distorted. I flipped through all of them, but there was nothing but white noise. Frustrated, I turned it off and grabbed my phone to scroll for a bit, hoping to wind down. But then, the lights started to flicker. Softly at first, then more intensely, until they went out completely. I sat up, startled by the sudden darkness. I reached over and flipped the switch on the bedside lamp, but it didn't turn on. The room was pitch black, and I could feel the darkness pressing in on me. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to navigate to the wall, trying the switches, but none of them worked. Suddenly I heard a soft knock on the door, 3 short, precise taps. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was late, past midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked over, my hand hovering over the peephole, debating whether to look. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway, lit by those same sickly lights. I stood there for a moment, waiting, but the knocking didn't come again. I turned back to the room, but as I did, I felt a chill pass over me, like someone had walked right through me. The smell was stronger now, sharp and unpleasant, like iron mixed with something sour. I glanced around the room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and that's when I saw it. The chair by the desk had been turned, facing the bed. I was sure I hadn't touched it since tossing my bag on it earlier. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the bedspread, right where I had been lying, were faint, wet stains, dark and spreading, like something had soaked through from the mattress below. I shined my flashlight closer, and my heart sank. The stains were deep red, and the more I looked, the clearer it became. It wasn't just on the bedspread. It was on the walls, too. Faint streaks that looked like they had been hastily scrubbed away but never fully cleaned. The smell was overpowering now, metallic and rancid, I backed away, feeling nauseous, and that's when I heard it, a faint whisper just behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The whispering continued, low and urgent, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I couldn't make out any words, just the soft, incessant murmur that sent chills through my entire body. I grabbed my bag, stumbling toward the door, desperate to get out. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking, and threw the door open, rushing into the hallway. The lights in the hallway flickered as I ran toward the elevator. I slammed the button repeatedly, my pulse racing, and when the doors finally opened, I practically leapt inside. I jabbed the button for the lobby, and as the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of the hallway. Standing at the far end, just at the edge of the flickering light, was a figure. It was blurry, out of focus, but I could see enough to know it wasn't just my imagination. It stood still, facing me, its form slightly hunched, like it was watching me leave. The elevator doors shut, and I was plunged into silence. I could feel my heart pounding, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd seen. When I reached the lobby, I rushed to the front desk, out of breath and pale. I told the night clerk that something was wrong with my room that I needed to change immediately. The clerk gave me a confused look, checking the computer. "You're in room 616?" he asked, almost like he couldn't believe it. When I nodded, he hesitated, then pulled up something on his screen. His face turned pale, and he muttered something under his breath before telling me to wait. After a few moments, he returned, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, but room 616 shouldn't have been booked. That floor is under renovation. There shouldn't have been anyone there." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "What do you mean? I was just in there. The door was unlocked." The clerk shook his head, visibly shaken. "No, that can't be. That room's been sealed off for months. There was an incident." He didn't elaborate, but I pressed him, too rattled to let it go. Eventually, he told me in hushed tones that a few months ago, a guest had been found dead in room 616. They said it was foul play, blood everywhere, the room left in such a state that it was never rented out again. The hotel had kept it quiet, hoping to avoid bad press. I felt my knees go weak. I had been sleeping in that room, lying on that bed. I had heard the whispers, smelled the blood, seen the figure in the hall. The clerk moved me to another room on a different floor, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay awake, the lights on, my eyes fixed on the door. When morning came, I checked out as fast as I could, driving away without looking back. I've stayed in plenty of hotels since, but nothing like that one. I always make sure to ask for a different room if I'm ever assigned to the 6th floor of any hotel. Every so often, I think about room 616, about the stains on the bed, the whispers in the dark, and the figure watching me leave. I'll never know exactly what happened there, but I'm certain of one thing. Some rooms should never be occupied again, because whatever happened in room 616, part of it stayed behind, and it's still waiting for its next guest. I never believed in ghosts, not really. Sure, I liked a good horror movie now and then, but that was all just entertainment. Stories to scare you before bed, nothing more. At least that's what I thought until I moved into my grandmother's old house after she passed away. The place was a creaky Victorian, with narrow hallways, dusty corners, and an attic that no one ever went into. Grandma always kept it locked, saying there were just old things up there, nothing worth the trouble of climbing those narrow stairs. But after she died, the house was left to me, and I had the curious urge to explore every inch of it, especially the attic. It was on a chilly Saturday afternoon when I finally decided to take a look. I found the key in a small box tucked under her bed, along with some other odds and ends. Faded photographs, a few old letters, and a worn-out doll missing one eye. The attic key was cold and heavy in my hand, like it had been waiting for someone to use it for a long time. The stairs creaked with every step as I climbed up, my flashlight beam dancing off the walls. The air grew colder the higher I went, and I felt a strange weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Finally, I reached the attic door. I hesitated for a moment, then slid the key into the lock and turned. The door swung open with a long, drawn-out groan, revealing the attic's dark, cavernous space. The smell of mildew and dust hit me immediately, and I coughed, waving the air in front of my face. As my flashlight flickered over old furniture covered in sheets and stacks of boxes, something caught my eye in the far corner. A large antique mirror stood there, taller than I was and framed in dark, intricately carved wood. It seemed out of place among the clutter, almost like it didn't belong there at all. As I approached it, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. The mirror was spotless, reflecting everything around it with an unsettling clarity. But something about it was wrong. I stepped closer, peering into the glass. My reflection stared back, but it felt off. Not the way I looked exactly, but something in the eyes. I felt like I was being watched, not just by my reflection, but by something else, something behind the mirror. I laughed it off, chalking it up to my imagination. I turned away and started going through the boxes. Most of them were filled with old clothes, newspapers, and knickknacks, but every now and then I'd glance back at the mirror. It was hard to ignore, like it was demanding my attention. At one point I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the mirror, my reflection was smiling, but I wasn't. I froze, staring at the grinning face that wasn't mine. My mind raced to find a logical explanation. Maybe the mirror was warped, maybe it was just a trick of the light. But then my reflection's eyes moved. They darted to the side as if looking at something behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. My reflection was normal again. Just me, wide-eyed and terrified. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. This was ridiculous. I was scaring myself over nothing. I decided I had seen enough of the attic for one day. As I turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I ran to it, yanking the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I banged on the door, shouting for help, but I knew no one would hear me. I was alone in the house. Then I heard it, a faint whispering like voices just out of earshot. I whipped around, shining my flashlight wildly around the room, but I couldn't see anything. The whispers grew louder, coming from all directions, echoing off the walls. I felt like the room was closing in on me. I backed up until I was standing in front of the mirror again. My reflection was there, but this time, it didn't match my movements. It just stood still, staring at me with those dark, empty eyes. I raised my hand and it didn't follow. Instead, it slowly reached out towards me, pressing its palm against the glass. I stumbled back, tripping over a box and falling hard onto the floor. My flashlight skittered away, leaving me in near darkness with only the faint glow from the attic window illuminating the room. I crawled backwards, not taking my eyes off the mirror. My reflection leaned closer to the glass, its smile growing wider, its eyes narrowing with malice. Then, to my horror, it stepped out. It didn't climb through the mirror or shatter the glass, it just stepped out like the mirror was nothing but a doorway. My doppelganger stood there towering over me, its smile stretching unnaturally wide, eyes glinting with a sinister light. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It reached down, grabbing me by the collar and lifting me effortlessly off the ground. I kicked and struggled, but its grip was like iron. It dragged me across the floor, closer to the mirror. I saw my reflection in the glass again, but it was wrong. My real reflection was still trapped inside, pounding on the other side, screaming soundlessly. I realized with horror that I was no longer in control. My doppelganger shoved me towards the mirror, and I felt a cold, suffocating pull as I was dragged into the glass. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own terrified face staring back at me, trapped behind the mirror's surface. Now I'm stuck here in this cold, empty space behind the glass, watching as my reflection, my imposter, lives my life. No one notices the difference, of course. It wears my face perfectly, mimics my voice, my movements. But I can see it. I see the glint in its eyes, the cruel twist of its smile when it thinks no one is looking. Every now and then, it glances at the mirror just for a second, and in that moment, I see the truth. It knows I'm still here, watching, waiting. But I don't know if I'll ever get out. I can only hope that one day someone else will come up to the attic and see me in the mirror, screaming for help. But until then, I'm trapped, just another lost soul in the house that no one believes is haunted. But trust me, it is. It was supposed to be a quick stopover, a night at a small town inn before hitting the road again. I was on a solo road trip making my way across the country, and I'd been driving all day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided to find a place to rest. That's when I saw it. A quaint little inn tucked away on the edge of a quiet town, with a sign that read "The Red Door Inn." It looked charming, old-fashioned, with ivy crawling up the brick walls and warm light spilling from the windows. I figured it was as good a place as any to crash for the night. The woman at the front desk was friendly enough, though she seemed a little distracted. She checked me in, handed me a heavy brass key, and told me my room was on the second floor, room 204. She mentioned breakfast would be served in the dining room at 7 a.m., but something about her demeanor felt off, like she was holding something back. I brushed it off, chalking it up to small-town quirks, and made my way upstairs. The inn was charming in that old, slightly creepy way, dimly lit hallways, vintage wallpaper peeling at the edges, and the faint scent of old wood and lavender. As I climbed the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced back a couple of times, but the hallway was empty. I found room 204 at the end of the hall. The door was painted a deep red, the color darker than the other doors on the floor. It stood out, almost like a warning, but I shrugged it off as a stylistic choice. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt a chill. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the inn, and there was an odd smell, like damp earth and something faintly metallic. I set my bag down and flicked on the light. The room was standard enough, a bed, a dresser, a small table by the window, but something about it felt wrong. The shadows seemed too deep, too dark, and the air was heavy, almost oppressive. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired from the long drive. I freshened up and settled into bed, hoping to get a good night's sleep before hitting the road again. As I lay there, the odd feeling persisted. I kept glancing at the red door, half expecting it to open on its own. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to distract myself by reading, but I couldn't focus. I finally turned off the light and pulled the covers up, trying to shake the growing sense of unease. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the sound of tree branches brushing against the window, but then I realized it was coming from inside the room. I lay still, my heart pounding, listening as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the red door. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The door rattled slightly, as if someone was on the other side trying to get in. I stared at it, half expecting it to swing open, but it remained closed. The tapping continued, a steady, relentless sound that echoed through the room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence. I waited, my eyes fixed on the door, but nothing happened. After a few tense moments, I got out of bed, grabbed the flashlight from my bag, and approached the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, but when I opened it, the hallway was empty. Just the same dim lighting and faded wallpaper. I closed the door, locking it this time, and crawled back into bed. I told myself it was just the old building settling, or maybe a draft moving something around. But as I tried to fall asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of faint whispering. It was muffled, like it was coming from the walls, the floor, everywhere at once. I lay there, frozen, straining to make out the words, but they were just out of reach. A low, rhythmic murmur that made my skin crawl. I turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the room. The shadows seemed to retreat, but I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or something more. I was about to get up when I noticed something that made my blood run cold, the red door. It was open, just a crack, even though I'd locked it. I stared at it, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I grabbed my bag, throwing on my shoes in a hurry, and bolted for the door. I didn't care about the late hour or that I hadn't checked out. I just wanted to get out of there. As I ran down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls, following me down the stairs. I burst into the lobby, panting and wild-eyed. The woman at the front desk looked up, surprised. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her expression shifting to concern. "There's something wrong with that room," I stammered, pointing back toward the stairs. "Room 204. The door, it kept opening, and there was this noise." She froze, her face paling. "Room 204, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," I said, confused by her reaction. "The red door. What's going on?" She stared at me for a moment, then shook her head, her expression clouded with something that looked like guilt. "That room, it's not supposed to be rented out," she said quietly. "It's been closed off for years." My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "What do you mean? You gave me the key." She fumbled with the computer, her hands shaking. "No, I didn't. Room 204 hasn't been available since the incident." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What incident?" She hesitated, then finally spoke, her voice low and haunted. "There was a guest years ago, a woman. She locked herself in that room and never came out. When we finally got the door open, it was too late. She'd scratched at the walls, tried to claw her way out. There were no windows in that room, no way for her to see outside. She'd written on the walls, over and over, 'Don't open the door. Don't let them in.'" My blood ran cold as her words sank in. I looked back toward the staircase, half expecting to see the red door looming at the top, waiting. The woman must have seen the fear in my eyes, because she shook her head, her expression grim. "We've had it locked ever since," she said, "but sometimes things happen. Guests find themselves there without knowing why. It's like the room calls to them." I didn't stick around to hear any more. I grabbed my things and left, the whispers still echoing in my ears. I drove all night, not stopping until I was miles away, the inn a distant memory in my rearview mirror. I still think about that room, about the red door and the feeling of being watched. Sometimes in the dead of night I hear the faintest tap, 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 like something trying to get in, and I wonder if whatever was in that room is still waiting, looking for someone else to open the door. If you ever find yourself at a quiet little inn with a red door, do yourself a favor, keep driving. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some rooms are better left forgotten. I was in between jobs and desperate for cash when I took the night shift as a front desk clerk at the Crescent Hotel. It was an old building with a faded grandeur, tucked away on a quiet street in the city, the kind of place that once catered to the elite but now saw more budget travelers and the occasional lost soul. It was easy work, mostly checking in late arrivals, answering the occasional call and keeping an eye on the lobby. I thought it would be the perfect gig to tide me over until I found something better. My first few shifts were uneventful. The guests were a mixed bag, businessmen passing through, young couples on a budget trip, and the occasional oddball who didn't quite fit in. The Crescent had seen better days, but it was clean enough, and the pay was decent. I'd pass the time reading, scrolling through my phone, or chatting with John, the night security guard. He'd worked at the Crescent for years and knew all the quirks of the old building. One night, about 2 weeks into the job, I was sitting at the desk when the phone rang. It was just past midnight, and the lobby was empty. I answered with the standard greeting, but all I got in response was a faint static, like a bad connection. I repeated my greeting, but there was no answer, just a low, rhythmic crackling that made my skin prickle. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I asked again, but the static continued, a soft, steady hum that seemed to grow louder the longer I listened. Finally, I hung up, chalking it up to a bad line. It wasn't the first time the phone system had acted up. The building was old and maintenance was rarely on top of things. About 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. I picked it up, expecting more static, but this time there was a voice. A woman's voice, soft and distant. Is someone there?" she asked, her words barely audible. "Yes, this is the front desk. How can I help you?" I replied. There was a pause, followed by a faint, shaky breath. I'm in room 616. I can't get out." I frowned. Room 616 had been empty for weeks. I'd checked the bookings myself. "Ma'am, are you sure about the room number? There's no one currently checked into 616. The line went quiet for a moment, then she whispered, "Please, I need help. It's dark and I can't find the door." Before I could ask anything else, the line went dead. I tried calling the room, but there was no answer, just the same static as before. I radioed John, letting him know about the strange call. He agreed to meet me on the 6th floor to check it out. We took the creaky old elevator up, the silence between us filled with an unspoken tension. The 6th floor was dimly lit, the bulbs flickering slightly as we stepped out. The carpet was worn, and the wallpaper peeled at the edges, adding to the eerie, neglected feel of the place. We walked down the hall, our footsteps muffled by the faded carpet. Room 616 was at the end, the door slightly ajar. John looked at me, his expression unreadable, and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the hallway. The air was stale, and there was a faint, musty smell that reminded me of an old basement. I flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. John pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, and the furniture covered in a thin layer of dust. There was no sign of anyone. I walked over to the phone on the nightstand and picked up the receiver. The line was dead, just a faint buzz of static. "Maybe it was a prank," John said, though he didn't sound convinced. We checked the bathroom, the closet, even under the bed, but the room was empty. I apologized to John for dragging him up there, and we headed back to the lobby. I tried to put the strange call out of my mind, but something about it nagged at me. I double-checked the guest log, but there was no record of anyone being in room 616. I mentioned it to the day manager the next morning, but she just shrugged it off, saying the old phone lines sometimes picked up signals from other rooms. The next night, the phone rang again at the same time. I hesitated before picking it up, half expecting to hear the same woman's voice. But this time, it was different. A man's voice, low and tense. "I'm in room 616. There's someone in here with me." My blood ran cold. "Sir, room 616 is supposed to be empty. Are you sure about the room number?" "Yes, I'm sure," the man said, his voice shaking. I woke up and the door was gone. I can hear someone whispering. I motioned for John, who was sitting in the lobby, and put the call on speaker. John's face paled as the man's voice crackled through the line. "Sir, we're on our way up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We rushed to the elevator, the sense of dread growing with each floor we passed. When we reached the 6th floor, the hallway felt colder, the air heavy with an unexplainable pressure. We approached room 616, but this time the door was locked. John pounded on it, calling out to the man, but there was no response. I fumbled with the master key, my hands shaking, and finally got the door open. The room was just as we'd left it, dark, empty, untouched. The bed was still made, the dust undisturbed. We searched the room again, but there was no sign of anyone. The phone on the nightstand was off the hook, and I could still hear the faint buzz of static. John and I exchanged uneasy looks, neither of us sure what to make of it. "Maybe it's the wires," John said, though he didn't sound convinced, "or someone messing with us." We returned to the lobby, the unease clinging to us like a shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with room 616, something beyond bad wiring or prank calls. I spent the rest of my shift on edge, jumping at every noise. On my next night off, I decided to dig into the hotel's history. I headed to the local library and pulled up old newspapers and records. It didn't take long to find something. The Crescent had been the site of a murder decades ago. A woman had been killed in room 616, strangled by her husband in the middle of the night. The husband claimed he'd seen someone else in the room, someone who whispered to him, telling him to do it. He was found wandering the halls, screaming that the door had disappeared, that he was trapped. The room had been closed off for years after the incident, but eventually it was put back into service. I found no other reports of strange occurrences, just the occasional mention of guests requesting to change rooms, saying they felt uncomfortable, like they were being watched. I returned to work with a new sense of unease. The next few nights passed quietly, and I started to think that maybe the calls had been a bizarre coincidence. But then, on a particularly stormy night, the phone rang again. This time it was different. The static was louder, more urgent, like a storm raging through the line. Room 616, a voice whispered, barely audible over the noise. "Help me." It was the same woman's voice, but this time it sounded distant, distorted. I didn't respond. I just listened, heart pounding, as the whispering grew louder, filling the lobby with a cold, electric buzz. The lights flickered and the phone went dead. John and I went up to the 6th floor one last time. The hallway was darker than I remembered, the air thick and stifling. As we approached room 616, the door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark interior. I hesitated, peering inside. The bed was unmade, the furniture rearranged as if someone had been there recently. And then I saw it, faint handprints smeared on the window as if someone had tried to claw their way out. The whispers started up again, faint and frantic, echoing through the empty room. We backed away, shutting the door and leaving the hallway in silence. We didn't go back to room 616 after that. The calls stopped and the hotel continued on as if nothing had happened. I quit the job not long after, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong with that room. Every now and then I think about the Crescent Hotel and room 616. I wonder if anyone else has heard the whispers, if anyone else has seen the handprints on the window. And I wonder who, or what, is still waiting inside, lost in a place they can't escape. So if you ever find yourself at the Crescent and you're offered room 616, do yourself a favor and ask for another room. Some doors are best left closed, and some calls are better left unanswered. I accepted a job as a night security guard at an old abandoned theater in Willow Creek, a small town known for its rich history and eerie legends. The Willow Creek Theater had once been a grand place where locals gathered for performances and movies, but after a tragic fire claimed several lives during a show, it was permanently closed. Since then, it had become a hot spot for ghost hunters and thrill seekers, but I needed the money and didn't believe in ghosts. On my first night, I arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The theater stood tall and foreboding, a relic of a bygone era. I stepped inside, the heavy door creaking ominously behind me. The air was stale, filled with the scent of mildew and burnt wood. I switched on my flashlight, illuminating the dusty seats and the faded stage, where echoes of laughter and applause still seemed to linger. My routine consisted of walking the aisles, checking the exits, and monitoring the security cameras. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I roamed the lobby, peeking into the old projection room and the dressing rooms, where remnants of old costumes hung like ghosts themselves. But as the clock struck midnight, the atmosphere changed. I was sitting in the lobby scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint noise coming from the stage. It sounded like music, soft, melancholic melodies that drifted through the air. I froze, staring at the empty stage. The music grew louder, a haunting tune that seemed to beckon me closer. Curiosity got the better of me. I stood and made my way to the stage, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As I stepped onto the stage, the music ceased abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. I glanced around, half expecting someone to be hiding there, but the theater was empty. Just as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head sharply, but again, nothing was there. A chill crawled down my spine, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice echoed back, taunting me. I decided to check the sound equipment in the booth, thinking someone might have left a radio on. As I climbed the stairs to the booth, the feeling of being watched intensified. I reached the booth, and my flashlight flickered. I frowned, tightening my grip on it. When I entered, I found everything in disarray. Wires hanging loose, old reels scattered across the floor. Then I heard it again, the music now louder and more insistent. I turned to the control panel, and to my surprise, the old audio equipment was lit up, buttons flickering as if someone had just been using it. I approached cautiously, my heart racing. Suddenly the music stopped, leaving a deafening silence. I felt a presence behind me, like a cold breath against my neck. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. But I was alone. Just then, the lights in the theater flickered back to life, illuminating the empty seats. I took a step back, my mind racing. The whispers began again, echoing through the room. "Help us! Help us!" Panic surged through me as I rushed back down to the stage, desperate to escape. But as I reached the bottom, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the stage, a woman in a vintage dress, her face obscured by shadows. "You must listen," she said, her voice a mere whisper. "We are trapped." "Who are you?" I stammered, backing away. The figure raised her hand, pointing toward the back of the theater. "You must find the truth. The fire. It was not an accident." Before I could respond, the theater plunged into darkness again. The panic inside me reached a fever pitch. I ran toward the exit, but the doors slammed shut, trapping me inside. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. "Find the truth. Find the truth." With my heart pounding in my chest, I recalled the stories I'd heard about the theater, the rumors of sabotage, the suspicion of foul play surrounding the fire. I needed to escape, but I felt compelled to understand what had happened. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to turn back toward the stage. I took my flashlight and shone it toward the woman, who was still standing there watching me. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Find the evidence in the archives," she urged, gesturing toward a door at the side of the stage. I hesitated for a moment, knowing I had to confront this fear. "Okay," I said, steeling myself. I ran toward the archives, the whispers guiding me. I found a dusty room filled with old records and newspapers. As I rifled through the documents, I stumbled upon an article about the fire. My breath caught as I read it. The headline screamed about a suspicious figure in the audience that night, someone who had been seen fleeing just before the flames erupted. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and I felt a surge of energy around me. The whispers quieted, replaced by the faint sound of applause. I turned to see the woman once more, her expression softening. "You've done well," she said. "Now we can finally rest." With that, the figures of the audience appeared, their faces serene, watching me with gratitude. I felt the weight of their sorrow lifting, an overwhelming sense of peace enveloping the theater. The doors swung open, and I stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. I glanced back at the theater, now quiet and still. I knew that I had helped them find their closure, and in return, they had freed me from the grip of fear. From that night on, I never returned to the Willow Creek Theater, but I often thought of the spirits who had once haunted its halls. Some places hold on to their secrets, but some souls just need a little help to find their way home. I've spent the last 3 years working as a night security guard at the historic Marlowe Art Gallery. The gallery was known for its stunning collections. but it also had a reputation for being haunted. The staff often whispered about strange occurrences, paintings that seemed to shift when no one was looking, flickering lights, and the occasional sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls. On a particularly stormy night, I arrived at the gallery, the rain pouring down in sheets. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and creating an eerie atmosphere. As I settled into the security office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt charged, thick with anticipation, as if the building itself was holding its breath. After a few uneventful rounds, I decided to check on a new exhibit that had just opened, a collection of portraits from the late 1800s. The portraits were hauntingly beautiful, capturing the essence of their subjects in a way that felt almost alive. I felt drawn to one in particular, a woman with striking green eyes and a mysterious smile. As I stood in front of the portrait, I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are you?" I whispered, as if the woman could hear me. I felt an inexplicable connection to her, something that tugged at my heart. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible above the sound of the rain. "Help me!" I glanced around, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, but only silence followed. I shook my head, brushing it off as my imagination. The wind howled outside, and I turned back to the portrait, my gaze locking onto the woman's eyes. "Please," the whisper came again, stronger this time. "You must find my story." The room felt colder, and I stepped back, startled. I had always been a skeptic, but this was different. I could feel her presence, palpable and urgent. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I was trapped," she said, her voice echoing in my mind. "I need you to uncover the truth." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and I felt a rush of air as if something had passed through me. The gallery was silent, but I could sense a heavy weight pressing down on me. I knew I had to help her. But how? I spent the next hour combing through the gallery's archives, searching for any information on the portrait and the woman it depicted. Eventually, I stumbled upon an old ledger that detailed the history of the artwork. Her name was Evelyn Sinclair, a talented artist who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances shortly after the portrait was painted. The more I read, the more I felt the weight of Evelyn's story. She had been in love with a fellow artist who had betrayed her, leaving her heartbroken and alone. The last entry I found mentioned a stormy night, much like the one I was experiencing when she had vanished without a trace. With this newfound knowledge, I returned to the gallery, my heart pounding. I stood before the portrait again, feeling the energy swirling around me. "Evelyn," I called out softly, "I know your story now. I want to help you." As I spoke, the air thickened, and I felt a rush of emotions, sadness, longing, and a deep sense of loss. I closed my eyes, trying to connect with her spirit. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Finish the painting," she whispered back, her voice like a gentle breeze. "Help them see me for who I truly was." I opened my eyes, realization dawning on me. The gallery had a collection of unfinished works stored away in the back. I hurried to the storage room, my heart racing as I searched for the canvas. Finally, I found it, an empty canvas, perfectly blank, waiting for a story to be told. I set up the easel and began to paint, guided by the emotions swirling within me. I poured every ounce of feeling into the strokes, capturing the essence of Evelyn, the joy, the sorrow, the passion that had driven her art. With each brush stroke, I felt her presence beside me, guiding my hand, filling me with inspiration. Hours passed, and as the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I stepped back to examine my work. The painting was beautiful. Evelyn's likeness seemed to come alive on the canvas, her expression full of hope and longing. I could feel her spirit radiating from the artwork. Just then, the gallery lights flickered back on, illuminating the room. I turned to find the portrait of Evelyn glowing softly, as if she were smiling at me. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice warm and filled with gratitude. "You've set me free." In that moment, I felt a wave of energy wash over me, and the weight in the air lifted. I knew Evelyn's spirit had finally found peace. The gallery felt lighter, the shadows receding as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows. From that day on, the Marlowe Art Gallery became known not just for its artwork, but for the story of Evelyn Sinclair. I shared her tale with visitors, ensuring that her memory and her art would never be forgotten. And every now and then, when I stood in front of her portrait, I could feel her presence beside me, a gentle reminder that even in darkness, there is beauty and hope waiting to be uncovered. I've been the night security guard at Hollow Creek Mental Institution for over a year. Once a renowned facility, it had fallen into disrepair after countless allegations of mistreatment and a series of scandals. Now, the building stood abandoned, its reputation tarnished, and the whispers of its dark past echoed through the empty halls. I took the job out of sheer necessity, but the ghost stories surrounding Hollow Creek intrigued me. The locals spoke of strange sounds at night, muffled cries, laughter that turned to screams, and the flickering of lights in the upper wards. I dismissed them as urban legends, but as my shifts progressed, I began to feel an unsettling presence lurking in the shadows. One particularly cold night in late January, I was making my rounds when I noticed something unusual. The door to the Forgotten Ward, a section of the hospital long sealed off due to its dark history, was slightly ajar. The air around it felt charged, almost electric. My heart raced as I approached, curiosity battling with caution. "Hello?" I called out, but only silence greeted me. I pushed the door open wider, revealing a dimly lit corridor lined with peeling wallpaper and rusted bed frames. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and despair. As I stepped inside, I felt a chill creep down my spine. The ward was eerily silent, but as I walked deeper, I began to hear faint whispers, soft, pleading voices that seemed to echo off the walls. "Help us. Please." I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a tempest. "Help us! Help us!" "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, and a cold breeze swept through the corridor, sending shivers down my spine. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the hall, barely illuminated by the flickering light. A woman in a tattered hospital gown stood there, her face pale and haunting. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "They're watching." "Who's watching?" I asked, stepping closer. "What happened here?" "The doctors, they did terrible things," she said, her voice trembling. "We thought we could trust them, but they turned us into experiments. We were never meant to be forgotten." Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. This ward had been the site of unspeakable horrors, where patients were subjected to cruel treatments and left to wither away. The spirits of the forgotten lingered, trapped in their pain. "I'm here to help you," I said, my voice steadier now. "What can I do?" "Free us," she pleaded, her expression shifting from fear to desperation. "You must find the records. The truth must be revealed." Without hesitation, I turned and raced down the corridor, searching for the records she spoke of. I knew the hospital had a storage room filled with old files, and if I could find them, I might uncover the truth behind the institution's dark past. As I reached the storage room, I fumbled with the lock, my heart racing. The door creaked open, revealing shelves filled with dusty boxes and forgotten memories. I began to sift through the files, searching for anything that could help the spirits find peace. Minutes turned into hours as I combed through the papers, each document revealing the harrowing stories of patients who had suffered unimaginable horrors. I found records of experimental treatments, forced lobotomies, and accounts of patients who had vanished without a trace. With each revelation, the air grew heavier, and the whispers intensified, urging me to keep going. Finally, I stumbled upon a folder labeled Case Files Unresolved. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it, revealing a series of names, patients who had been declared missing, their fates unknown. At the bottom of the folder was a note from a doctor detailing the unethical experiments conducted on the patients, including a list of those who had died in the ward. I knew I had to do something with this information. "I'll make sure your stories are heard," I promised, my voice echoing in the dark room. "I'll expose the truth." As I gathered the files, I felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The whispers transformed into a chorus of grateful voices, their energy enveloping me like a warm embrace. "Thank you. Thank you." But just as I turned to leave, the lights flickered violently, and a cold presence descended upon me. "You cannot leave," a voice boomed, echoing through the storage room. I turned to see a dark figure emerging from the shadows, its eyes glowing with malice. "Get out!" I shouted, fear gripping me. The figure lunged forward, and I dashed past it, clutching the files tightly to my chest. I raced down the corridor, the whispers growing louder, urging me to escape. As I reached the exit, the dark figure was right behind me, its icy breath chilling my spine. I burst through the door and sprinted into the night, the cold air invigorating me as I escaped the horrors of Hollow Creek. With the files in hand, I knew I had the power to expose the truth. I would share the stories of the forgotten patients, ensuring that their suffering would not be in vain. In the days that followed, I worked tirelessly to bring attention to the dark history of Hollow Creek. The truth came to light, and with it, the spirits of the ward found peace. I could feel their presence surrounding me, their whispers now filled with gratitude instead of despair. Though the institution stood abandoned, the memories of those lost souls would never fade. I had become their voice, and in doing so I realized that some spirits never truly leave. They linger, waiting for someone to tell their story and ensure they are never forgotten. I work as a night security guard at the old lighthouse point for nearly a year. Perched on a rocky cliff overlooking the turbulent sea, the lighthouse had been decommissioned for decades. But the townsfolk still believed it was haunted by the spirit of its last keeper, a man named John Whitaker. According to legend, he had vanished one stormy night while trying to save a ship in distress, and his ghost remained, eternally watching over the waves. I was drawn to the lighthouse not just for the job, but for the thrill of its mysteries. The first few months were uneventful, just the sound of the wind howling and the waves crashing below. But as the nights grew colder, strange things began to happen. I would hear whispers carried by the wind, and the light at the top of the tower flickered on and off, even though the lamp had long since burned out. One particularly stormy night in late November, the wind howled like a banshee, and rain lashed against the old stone walls. I was making my usual rounds when I noticed something unusual, a faint glow emanating from the top of the lighthouse. My heart raced as I climbed the spiral staircase, the wind howling louder with each step. As I reached the top, I gasped. The lantern room was illuminated, the glass panes shimmering with an otherworldly light. In the center stood a figure, his back turned to me, gazing out at the raging sea. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, revealing a weathered face and kind eyes. It was John Whitaker, just as the legends described him. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "It's too dangerous." "What happened to you?" I asked, my curiosity overpowering my fear. Are you a ghost?" He nodded solemnly. "I am the keeper of this light, bound to protect the sailors from the storm, but I cannot leave this place until my duty is fulfilled." "What do you need?" I asked, feeling a connection to the man before me. He gestured to the raging sea. "A ship is in trouble tonight. They need guidance to safety, but the light has gone dim. I can only help them if the lighthouse is lit." The realization hit me. "But the lamp is broken. We can't turn it on." John's gaze was intense. "You must find a way. The lives of those at sea depend on it." Determined to help, I raced down the stairs, my heart pounding. I remembered seeing a supply room stocked with old equipment. I dashed through the door, rummaging through dusty boxes until I found an old oil lamp. It was battered, but still functional. I grabbed it, along with a canister of oil, and hurried back up the stairs. As I reached the lantern room, I caught sight of John again. His expression was one of desperation as he watched the storm rage on. "Hurry," he urged, his voice rising above the howling wind. I quickly filled the lamp with oil and struck a match. The flame flickered to life, casting a warm glow in the cold, dark room. With trembling hands, I set the lamp into the old lantern's cradle and ignited the wick. As the light spread, John's face lit up with hope. "You did it," he exclaimed, stepping closer to the window. "Now we can guide them home." I joined him at the window, my heart racing as I peered out at the stormy sea. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, and I could see the faint outline of a ship struggling against the tide. The crew was in danger, and I knew our light was their only chance. "Keep it steady," John shouted, and I watched as he focused all his energy on the light, intensifying its glow. The beam shot out across the water, piercing through the storm like a beacon of hope. Miraculously, the ship began to turn, its sails catching the wind as it angled toward the light. I could hear the distant shouts of the crew, their voices carried by the wind. "They see it," I cried, tears of relief filling my eyes. "They're coming." As the ship drew closer, I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. The light illuminated the rocky cliffs, guiding the vessel to safety. The crew worked tirelessly, their determination shining through the storm. But just as I thought all was well, the wind howled louder, and the storm intensified. John turned to me, his expression grave. "It's not over yet. The storm is too powerful. I cannot hold the light alone." Fear gripped me, but I didn't hesitate. "What can I do?" "Focus on the light with me," he said, urgency in his voice. "Channel your energy. Together, we can keep it burning bright." I nodded, stepping closer to him. We stood side by side, our hands raised toward the lamp. As I concentrated, I felt a surge of energy flowing through me, merging with John's spirit. The light grew brighter, illuminating the night sky like a star. "Do not falter," John urged, his voice steady. "We are stronger together." With every ounce of strength, I poured my heart into the light, feeling the warmth radiate from within. The storm raged, but we held our ground, the beam cutting through the darkness. Finally, the ship sailed past the treacherous rocks, safe at last. I could hear the cheers of the crew, their gratitude washing over me like a wave. But as the storm began to calm, I felt John's presence fading. "It's time for me to go," he said softly, a peaceful smile gracing his lips. "You've done more than you know. You've set me free." "No, please," I cried, panic rising within me. "You can't leave." He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You've lit the way for others, and now I can find my peace. Thank you, Sarah." With that, he began to fade, the light in the lantern flickering as the storm subsided. I stood in the lantern room, tears in my eyes, watching as he disappeared into the night, his spirit finally at rest. As dawn broke over the horizon, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, illuminating the lighthouse. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the morning sun on my skin. From that day on, Lighthouse Point was no longer just an abandoned structure. It became a symbol of hope and salvation. I continued my work, ensuring the light remained a beacon for those at sea. And every night as I stood watch, I could feel John's presence with me, guiding me in my duty, a reminder that some spirits never truly leave. They simply become the light for others to find their way home. I always thought moving to a secluded house on the edge of town would be perfect for my writing. Peaceful, inspiring, and away from distractions. The old Victorian house was everything I could have hoped for. Grand architecture, sprawling gardens, and a timeless charm. But it wasn't until the first night there that I realized this house had its own stories to tell, and they were far from comforting. It started subtly. The first sign was a faint whispering sound I couldn't quite place. I brushed it off as the wind, or maybe the house settling. But it didn't take long for the whispers to grow more persistent. I remember the exact moment it shifted from eerie to terrifying. I was working late, typing away in my study, when the whispers turned into something more. The voice, barely audible, seemed to come from behind the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading and frantic. Naturally, I checked the house. I found nothing. No hidden compartments, no loose floorboards. I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, the nightmares began. Each night I dreamt of a shadowy figure moving through the house, always just out of sight. I'd wake up in cold sweat, convinced I'd heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. Every morning, I'd find small, disturbing changes. A book out of place, a photo frame slightly askew, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to explore the house in the dark. Armed with only a flashlight, I moved through the rooms, my heart pounding with each step. The whispers were louder now, almost urgent. I traced them to the study where the sound seemed to be coming from behind the wall. I examined the wall closely. To my surprise, I discovered a faint outline of a door, a hidden panel. With trembling hands, I pried it open. Behind it was a narrow, dusty passageway leading to a small, dimly lit room. Inside the room, I found a wooden chest. My curiosity overcame my fear, and I opened it. Inside were old letters, photographs, and a diary. The diary's pages were filled with frantic scrawls. One word repeated over and over: help. And I scanned through the letters and realized they were written by a woman named Eleanor, who had once lived in the house over a century ago. Her words spoke of being trapped and tormented by an unknown presence. The final entries detailed her growing despair and a chilling discovery. She was not alone, but being watched and manipulated by something unseen. As I read, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispers were no longer just sounds, they were a part of Eleanor's unfinished story. I could feel her fear wrapping around me, intensifying with every word I read. Then I found it. The last letter was addressed to me. It said, "You must leave. He's coming for you." I looked around, my flashlight flickering as if reacting to the growing darkness in the room. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure in the corner of the room, moving closer with each passing second. My heart raced as I backed away, desperate to escape. I ran through the house, the whispers now a cacophony of terror, following me with every step. I burst out of the front door, not stopping until I reached the streetlight at the edge of the property. Gasping for breath, I looked back at the house. It was then that I saw the twist, the figure standing in the window. Not just a shadow, but a clear reflection. It was me. My own face twisted in anguish, looking back at me through the glass. I spent the night in a hotel, unable to return to the house. The next day, I found out that Eleanor's story wasn't just a tale of torment. It was a warning. The house had a history of claiming those who dug too deep, trapping their souls within its walls. I never went back to the Victorian house, but I couldn't escape the whispers. They followed me, whispering in my dreams and in the silence of my new home. I've come to realize that the house didn't want to let go of me. It wanted to keep me as part of its story, just like Eleanor. So that's the story of my night in the haunted Victorian house. Sometimes the scariest things aren't the monsters we see, but the ones we become a part of. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more spine-chilling tales. And remember, next time you hear a whisper in the walls, maybe don't investigate. It might just be the beginning of your own nightmare. It was a cold, rainy evening when I moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town. The place had been empty for years, and the landlord was eager to rent it out, offering me a deal I couldn't refuse. Maybe if I'd been more cautious, I'd have noticed the strange way he avoided my eyes or the way his hands trembled slightly when he handed me the keys. The house was beautiful in a decaying sort of way. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards creaked with every step, but there was something undeniably charming about it. It wasn't until my first night there that I started to feel uneasy. I'd just finished unpacking and was about to turn in when I heard it. A soft, scratching sound coming from within the walls. I dismissed it as the house settling or some sort of rodent. But the scratching persisted, growing louder and more deliberate as the night wore on. By the time morning arrived, I was exhausted but determined to ignore it. I chalked it up to my imagination running wild. After all, who wouldn't be creeped out after moving into a 19th century house in the middle of a thunderstorm? Days passed, and the scratching continued, always more intense at night. I decided to investigate. So one evening, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I pried off a section of the wall in the basement where the sound seemed to be coming from. The wall was solid, and there was nothing behind it but old bricks and mortar. I patched up the wall and tried to convince myself that I'd been mistaken. But the scratching didn't stop. It evolved into a rhythmic tapping, almost like a Morse code. The pattern was eerie and unsettling, and it seemed to be coming from all corners of the house. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I set up a camera in the basement, hoping to catch some evidence of whatever was causing the noise. I watched the footage the next morning, and my blood ran cold. At 2:37 a.m., the camera showed a shadowy figure moving along the wall where I had previously removed the bricks. The figure was distorted, and its movements were erratic, almost as if it was trying to escape something. Panicked, I called the landlord. He was reluctant to talk, but eventually agreed to come by. When he arrived, I showed him the footage. His face turned pale, and he quickly ushered me outside. He confessed that the house had a history, but he had left out the most horrifying detail. The previous tenants had all experienced the same noises. Each one had eventually left in terror, unable to endure the relentless disturbances. The landlord had been too afraid to say anything, fearing it would scare away potential renters. I demanded to know more. With a shaky voice, he told me about the house's original owner, a man named Jonathan Harker, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances over a century ago. It was rumored that Harker had been involved in occult practices and had locked something malevolent within the walls before vanishing. Determined to uncover the truth, I called in a team of paranormal investigators. They arrived with equipment and conducted a thorough investigation. What they found was chilling. An old diary buried in the wall behind a hidden compartment. The diary belonged to Jonathan Harker, and its final entries were filled with desperate pleas for help and mentions of something dark and hungry that lurked behind the walls. The investigators concluded that Harker had indeed trapped something in the walls, a dark entity that fed on fear and suffering. They performed a cleansing ritual, and for a while, the house was quiet. I stayed there for a few more weeks before moving out, unable to shake the feeling that something still lingered. Months later, as I was browsing through old newspaper archives, I stumbled upon an article about a mysterious fire that had destroyed the house a few weeks after I left. The fire had been labeled accidental, but the article mentioned something chilling. The firefighters had reported hearing strange noises from within the walls just before the fire broke out. I'll never forget the feeling of dread that washed over me as I read that article. To this day, I can't help but wonder if the entity had finally found a way out, or if it had simply moved on to a new victim. So if you ever find yourself in an old house with mysterious noises, remember my story. Sometimes the things hidden in the walls are better left undisturbed. I've always had a fascination with vintage items, particularly dolls. They hold stories, memories of childhood, and a sense of nostalgia that draws me in. So, when I stumbled upon an old antique shop in the heart of the city, I couldn't resist stepping inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt a shiver of excitement and unease. The shop was dimly lit, filled with an eclectic assortment of items, each with its own tale to tell. As I wandered through the narrow aisles, my gaze landed on a doll sitting on a dusty shelf in the corner. Its porcelain face was delicately painted, with bright blue eyes that seemed to sparkle even in the muted light. It wore a faded blue dress, and its hair, though tangled, had once been beautifully styled. I reached for the doll, feeling an inexplicable connection. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with piercing eyes, approached me. "Ah, the forgotten doll," she said, her voice a whisper. "She has a history, you know. Many have taken her home, but she has never stayed long." "What do you mean?" I asked, intrigued. "They say the doll carries a spirit," the woman replied, her gaze locking onto mine. "It yearns for a friend, but brings misfortune to those who possess it." I hesitated, but the allure of the doll was too strong. I decided to buy it, dismissing the shopkeeper's warnings as mere superstition. That evening I placed the doll on a shelf in my bedroom, its presence filling me with a strange sense of comfort. As the days passed, however, I began to notice odd occurrences. At night I would hear soft whispers echoing through my room, and sometimes I would catch a glimpse of the doll's eyes seeming to follow me. I brushed it off as my imagination until one fateful night when everything changed. I woke suddenly to the sound of soft giggling. Confused and disoriented, I turned on my bedside lamp, the light illuminating my room. To my shock, I saw the doll sitting upright on my bed, its eyes wide and gleaming in the glow. "Emily," it whispered, the voice sweet yet haunting. "Play with me." Fear coursed through me, but I felt an inexplicable urge to comply. As if in a trance, I picked up the doll and began to rock it gently in my arms. The room filled with a warm glow, and the whispers grew louder, merging into a symphony of laughter and joy. For a fleeting moment I felt a connection, as if the doll were a long-lost friend. But the happiness was short-lived. The next morning I awoke to find my entire room in disarray. Items scattered across the floor, the curtains torn down, and the doll lying in the corner, its expression vacant. A sense of dread settled over me, and I wondered if I had unleashed something dark. Despite my fear, I couldn't bring myself to part with the doll. I felt an attachment that I couldn't explain. I decided to research the doll's history, hoping to understand what I had brought into my home. After days of digging, I uncovered a chilling story. The doll had once belonged to a young girl named Clara, who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. Legends swirled around her disappearance, and it was said that the doll held Clara's spirit, longing for companionship and closure. Realizing the weight of the doll's history, I felt an overwhelming urge to help Clara find peace. That night, I set up a small ritual in my living room, lighting candles and placing the doll in the center. I closed my eyes and focused, hoping to connect with Clara's spirit. "Clara," I called softly, "I'm here for you. I want to help you find peace." The air grew heavy, and I felt a chill sweep through the room. Suddenly the doll's eyes glowed, and the whispers returned, more insistent than ever. "Help me," they echoed, weaving through the air like a haunting melody. I took a deep breath, heart racing. "What do you need from me?" I asked. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a surge of energy. "Find my family," Clara's voice urged, filled with desperation. "I want them to know I'm safe." Determined to fulfill her wish, I began searching for Clara's family. I visited local archives and reached out to historians, piecing together the fragments of her story. I discovered that Clara had lived in the very neighborhood where I now resided, and her family had searched tirelessly for her after she vanished. Finally, I found a living relative, a distant cousin who had never given up hope. I arranged to meet with her, eager to share Clara's story and the connection I had formed with the doll. When I met Clara's cousin, a kind elderly woman named Margaret, I shared everything I had discovered. As I spoke, tears filled her eyes. I always believed Clara was still with us, that she was watching over us, she said, her voice trembling. I handed her the doll, feeling a sense of release. This belongs to Clara. She wants you to know she's safe. Margaret cradled the doll in her arms, her face lighting up with recognition. Oh, my sweet Clara, she whispered, a flood of memories washing over her. I've missed you so much. In that moment, I felt a wave of warmth enveloping me. The whispers faded into a soft lullaby, and the doll's eyes glimmered with gratitude. Clara's spirit had finally found peace, her longing fulfilled. After the encounter, I returned home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The doll was gone, but I knew it was where it belonged. The air in my room felt fresh and vibrant, free from the shadows that had once haunted me. In the weeks that followed, I continued to share Clara's story with others in the community, ensuring that her memory lived on. The once-forgotten doll had brought closure not only to Clara but also to her family, rekindling a sense of hope and love. And though I never saw the doll again, I felt its presence in my heart, a reminder that even the darkest stories can lead to healing, and that sometimes all it takes to find peace is a little compassion and connection. Music has always been my passion, a refuge from the chaos of life. But everything changed when I stumbled upon an old, dusty violin in a forgotten corner of the local antique shop. Little did I know, this violin carried a dark secret, one that would lead me down a path of terror and despair. The moment I laid eyes on the violin, I felt an inexplicable connection. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate designs etched into the wood. The shopkeeper warned me that it had a history, having belonged to a musician named Victor Langley who met a mysterious end. Rumor had it that anyone who played the violin would be cursed, haunted by the melody that once brought Victor fame. Ignoring the shopkeeper's warning, I purchased the violin, convinced that I could unlock its potential. That evening, I brought it home and set it up in my modest studio. As I drew the bow across the strings, an ethereal sound filled the room, unlike anything I had ever heard. The notes seemed to dance in the air, weaving a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. But as I played, I began to feel a strange presence surrounding me. The air grew thick and heavy, and shadows flickered at the edges of my vision. I paused, heart racing, but the music called to me, urging me to continue. I played on, lost in the beauty of the sound, unaware of the darkness that lurked just beyond the notes. As the days passed, I became obsessed with the violin. I practiced for hours, each session drawing me deeper into its enchanting grip. But the whispers began to grow louder, echoing in my mind. "Play the melody," they urged, their voices overlapping like a haunting chorus. One night, as I played, the shadows coalesced into a figure, a man dressed in tattered clothing, his face obscured by darkness. My heart pounded as he reached out to me, a desperate look in his eyes. "Stop," he begged. "You must stop playing." "Who are you?" I stammered, fear gripping me. "I am Victor Langley," he replied, his voice a mere whisper. "The music, it binds me here. You must break the curse." With that, the figure vanished, leaving me shaken. I realized that the violin wasn't just an instrument, it was a vessel for Victor's tormented spirit. I had unwittingly awakened something dark, and I knew I had to uncover the truth behind the curse. The next day, I delved into Victor's past, uncovering a tragic story of ambition and betrayal. He had been a prodigious talent, adored by many, but jealousy consumed him. His closest rival had sabotaged his career, and in a fit of despair, Victor had taken his own life, leaving behind the violin as his only legacy. Determined to help him find peace, I returned to my studio that evening, the violin resting ominously on the stand. "Victor," I called out, "I want to help you. How can I break this curse?" The air grew cold and the shadows shifted, coalescing into Victor's form once more. "You must play the final composition," he said, his voice filled with anguish. "It is the only way to free me." "What final composition?" I asked, confusion swirling in my mind. "The one I never had the chance to finish," he replied, his eyes pleading. "The one that holds my essence." With a surge of determination, I searched through the pages of music I had collected over the years, hoping to find something that resonated with Victor's spirit. I stumbled upon an unfinished score tucked away in a folder, its notes hauntingly beautiful yet incomplete. As I studied the composition, I could feel Victor's presence guiding me, urging me to complete it. I worked feverishly, pouring my heart and soul into the music, each note resonating with the emotions of despair and longing. The whispers returned, growing into a symphony of voices that surrounded me, pushing me to finish what had been started. On the night of the full moon, I stood in my studio, trembling with anticipation. I placed the violin under my chin, the unfinished score in front of me. As I began to play, the room filled with a haunting melody, the air thick with emotion. The music flowed from my fingertips, weaving together the beauty of life and the sorrow of loss. As I reached the final notes, I felt a rush of energy surge through me. The shadows swirled around the room, and Victor's figure materialized, a look of peace settling on his face. "You've done it," he whispered, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you." With that, the shadows began to dissipate, the oppressive weight lifting from the room. The music faded, replaced by a serene silence. I felt a warmth envelop me, and for the first time, I knew that Victor was finally free. As dawn broke, the sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating my studio. The violin lay silent, the curse lifted. I had transformed its dark legacy into a symbol of hope and redemption. In the weeks that followed, I shared Victor's story with my students, teaching them that music has the power to heal, to connect us to those who have come before. The cursed melody became a tale of triumph, a reminder that even the darkest past can be transformed into something beautiful. And while the violin now rested quietly, I knew that its spirit would live on in the hearts of those who played, a testament to the enduring power of music and a bond that transcended time. I'm a high school history teacher, the kind of person who loves dusty books and the smell of aged paper. But one fateful evening, my unremarkable life took a turn into the realm of the terrifying. It was an ordinary Friday night when I decided to stop by an antique shop after work. The shop, a small and cluttered place called Curiosities and Relics, was filled with oddities and treasures from bygone eras. As I wandered through the aisles, I stumbled upon an ornate mirror framed in dark wood, its surface surprisingly pristine despite its evident age. Something about it called to me, and I felt an inexplicable urge to take it home. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a knowing smile, raised an eyebrow as I picked it up. "Be careful with that one," she warned. "Mirrors have a way of showing more than just reflections." I chuckled, thinking she was just trying to sell me on the item, but as I left the shop, her words lingered in my mind. That night, I hung the mirror in my bedroom, admiring its beauty. But as I got ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I looked into the mirror, I saw not just my reflection, but a flicker of movement behind me, a shadow that seemed to dart away whenever I turned to look. I shrugged it off as fatigue and went to sleep. Over the next few days, however, the strange occurrences escalated. As I passed by the mirror, I would often catch glimpses of someone standing behind me, always just out of view. At first, I convinced myself it was my imagination, but the feeling of being watched grew more intense. One evening, after a long day at school, I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my teeth. As I glanced up, I saw a figure behind me, a woman with long, flowing hair and an expression of deep sorrow. I gasped and turned around, but the room was empty. My heart raced as I stared back at my reflection, sweat trickling down my back. The next night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. "Who are you?" I demanded, standing before the mirror. "What do you want?" At first, there was silence, but then a soft whisper filled the air. "Help me. Help me." The voice was filled with desperation, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "How can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Find my name," she pleaded, her form flickering like a candle flame. "I am trapped, forgotten." I felt an overwhelming sense of compassion wash over me. "I'll help you," I promised. "But how?" The woman's image grew clearer, and she pointed toward the mirror. "Look deeper. My story is within." With a deep breath, I focused on the glass, allowing my mind to drift. Suddenly, the surface shimmered, and images began to unfold before me, a series of memories, each one more vivid than the last. I saw a young woman, dressed in a beautiful gown, laughing joyously with friends. Then the scene shifted to a darkened room, filled with shadows, and I could hear her cries echoing in despair. She was being pushed away, forgotten by those she loved. The fragments of her life played out like a film, and I could feel her pain and longing. In one haunting moment, I saw her standing before the mirror, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Remember me." As the memories faded, I grasped the essence of her story, a tragic tale of love and loss. I felt compelled to uncover her name. I rushed to my bookshelf, searching through my history books for any hint of her identity. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I stumbled upon an old diary tucked between the pages of a dusty tome. The diary belonged to a woman named Eliza Hart, a young artist who had lived in the late 1800s. As I read through her entries, I learned of her passion for painting and her love for a man who had ultimately betrayed her. The final entry was filled with despair, detailing how she had vanished one stormy night, leaving her art and her name behind. My heart raced as I realized the connection. "Eliza," I shouted, filled with determination. "Your name is Eliza." In that moment, the mirror shimmered, and the woman's image materialized before me, tears of relief in her eyes. "You found me," she whispered, her voice a gentle caress. "Thank you." Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted, and I felt a warmth enveloping me. "You are free now," I said, my heart swelling with compassion. "You will be remembered." Eliza's form began to glow, and with a radiant smile she replied, "I can finally rest." As the light filled the room, the mirror sparkled like 1,000 stars, and I felt her presence lifting away, the shadows that had bound her dissipating into the air. When I looked into the mirror again, I saw only my reflection. The haunting sorrow that had lingered for days was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. I had helped her find closure, and in doing so I had discovered the power of memory and the importance of honoring those who had come before us. In the days that followed, I returned to the antique shop, the mirror still hanging in my bedroom. I spoke to the shopkeeper, sharing Eliza's story and the power of the mirror. She smiled knowingly, her eyes shining with understanding. "Mirrors are more than just glass," she said. "They hold the stories of those who came before us." Thank you for giving her the closure she needed. I left the shop with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to keep Eliza's memory alive. And every now and then, when I passed by the mirror, I would catch a glimpse of her smile in the reflection, an eternal reminder of the bond we had forged and the stories that continue to echo through time. As a budding pianist, I spent countless hours practicing in my small apartment, losing myself in the melodies that flowed from my fingertips. It was during one of those late-night practice sessions that I stumbled upon an old, dusty sheet of music tucked away in a second-hand bookshop. The music was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its notes danced across the page in an intricate pattern, and the title read, "The Lament of the Forgotten." Intrigued, I purchased the sheet and hurried home, eager to learn the haunting melody. That night, as the moonlight streamed through my window, I sat down at my piano and began to play. The notes filled the room, wrapping around me like a warm embrace. But as I played, I felt a strange energy emanating from the music, a deep sorrow that tugged at my heartstrings. It was as if the melody held a story of loss and longing. As I reached the final note, a chill swept through the room. For a fleeting moment, I could have sworn I heard a whisper, a soft voice carried on the wind. "Thank you. Thank you." It echoed, but I brushed it off as my imagination. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessed with the piece. I practiced tirelessly, the haunting melody resonating in my mind. But as I played, I began to notice peculiar occurrences. Objects in my apartment would shift position, and shadows danced at the corners of my vision. I dismissed them as fatigue, but the feeling of being watched lingered. One evening, as I played the piece for the umpteenth time, I noticed a figure standing in the doorway of my living room. It was a woman, her features obscured by darkness, but her eyes glimmered with an otherworldly light. My heart raced as I stopped playing, the last notes hanging in the air. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I am the muse of this melody," she replied, her voice a soft, ethereal whisper. "You have awakened me." I could feel a chill in the air as she stepped closer, her form becoming clearer. She wore a flowing gown that shimmered like starlight, and her presence filled the room with an eerie beauty. For years I have been trapped, my spirit bound to this music. Only through you can I find peace. "What do you want from me?" I asked, fear gripping my heart. "You must finish the composition," she said, her eyes pleading. "There is a final verse that has been lost to time. Only when you play it will I be set free." I hesitated, torn between fear and compassion. How can I find the final verse? "Listen closely to the whispers of the past," she instructed. "The melody will guide you." With trepidation, I agreed to help her. That night I sat at the piano, determined to uncover the missing notes. As I played the existing parts of the piece, I closed my eyes and listened, letting the music wash over me. The whispers returned, swirling around me like a soft breeze. "Hear us! Hear us!" they sang, urging me to dig deeper into the melody. I focused, allowing my fingers to dance on the keys, and in that moment, I felt a surge of inspiration. Suddenly, the notes began to flow, each one revealing itself as if they had been waiting for me to discover them. I played with fervor, feeling the spirit of the woman guiding my hands. The music transformed into a beautiful, poignant arrangement filled with the weight of loss and hope. As I reached the final note of the piece, the room was filled with a bright light, and the woman appeared before me, a radiant smile gracing her lips. "You've done it. You've set me free," she exclaimed, her voice echoing with joy. But as she stepped closer, the light began to dim, and her expression shifted to one of sorrow. "I must go now, but know that my spirit will always be with you," she said, her voice trembling. "You will carry the melody in your heart, and it will guide you through life." With that, she began to fade, the light enveloping her until she was nothing more than a shimmering silhouette. I felt a warmth wash over me, a deep sense of peace that filled the void left behind. As she disappeared completely, I sat in silence, overwhelmed by what had just happened. The haunting melody lingered in the air, resonating within me. I had not only completed the composition, but had also freed a spirit bound by sadness for so long. In the days that followed, I found myself playing the completed piece over and over, sharing it with friends and family. Each time I played, I felt a connection to the woman, as if she was there with me, guiding my fingers across the keys. Eventually, I decided to perform the piece at a local concert, wanting to share the beauty of the melody with the world. As I took the stage, my heart raced with anticipation. I closed my eyes and began to play, allowing the music to flow through me. As I reached the final note, A wave of emotion washed over the audience. The room was filled with a palpable energy, and I could feel the spirit of the woman surrounding me, her presence woven into the fabric of the melody. When I finished, the crowd erupted in applause, but I felt a deeper sense of fulfillment. I had not only honored the woman's memory, but had also given her the freedom she sought. Years later, I still play the piece, and each time I do, I remember the haunting melody that bound us together. The whispers of the past continue to guide me, a reminder that music has the power to transcend time and space, bridging the gap between the living and the lost. And every note I play feels like a tribute to the woman who once was, her spirit forever woven into my heart. As a watchmaker in the small town of Eldridge, I found solace in the intricate mechanics of clocks, each tick a reminder of the fleeting nature of time. My shop was a humble place, filled with the gentle ticking of various clocks, but it was also home to a family secret that had been passed down through generations. One rainy afternoon, as I was organizing my workshop, I stumbled upon an old, dusty box hidden beneath a workbench. Intrigued, I opened it to discover a collection of intricate clock parts and a worn leather journal. The journal was filled with detailed sketches and notes about a mysterious clock known as the Eternal Timekeeper. According to the journal, the Eternal Timekeeper was said to possess the ability to manipulate time itself, a clock that could rewind or fast-forward moments in a person's life. My heart raced at the thought. Could such a device truly exist? Driven by curiosity and the allure of the unknown, I decided to investigate further. As the days passed, I became obsessed with the legend of the Eternal Timekeeper. I spent sleepless nights poring over the journal, deciphering my ancestors' cryptic notes. It spoke of a hidden mechanism, a secret chamber within the old clock tower that had stood at the center of Eldridge for over a century. Determined to uncover the truth, I set out to find the clock tower. The town was shrouded in fog as I approached the towering structure, its weathered exterior a testament to the passage of time. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the creaking sound echoing through the empty chamber. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of aged wood. I climbed the winding staircase, my heart pounding with anticipation. At the top, I found the clock mechanism, a beautiful assembly of gears and pendulums all in perfect harmony, ticking away with precision. But it was the wall behind the clock that caught my attention. The journal had mentioned a hidden panel, and I began to search for it. After several minutes of probing, I found a loose brick near the base of the wall. With a gentle push, it slid away to reveal a small compartment. Inside lay an ornate clock face, unlike anything I had ever seen. Its intricate design shimmered in the dim light, and as I reached for it, I felt a surge of energy coursing through my fingers. I knew in that moment that this was the Eternal Timekeeper. With trembling hands, I carefully removed the clock face and examined it closely. It was adorned with strange symbols, and a single hand that pointed to a place on the dial labeled Now. The journal hinted that to activate the clock, I would need to set it to a specific time and ask a question. I pondered the implications of the clock. What would I ask? The temptation to relive moments from my past was strong, but as a watchmaker, I understood the importance of time, how every moment, good or bad, shaped who we are. After much contemplation, I decided to set the clock to the moment of my father's passing, a time that had haunted me since I was a child. I wanted to understand the events that had led to that day, to find closure for the pain I had carried for so long. As I turned the hand of the Eternal Timekeeper to the designated time, a low hum filled the air, and the clock began to glow. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "What happened that day?" In an instant, I was engulfed in blinding light. When it faded, I found myself standing in my childhood home, the familiar scent of my mother's cooking wafting through the air. Confusion washed over me as I realized I was a ghost in my own past, watching the events unfold. I could see my younger self playing in the living room, unaware of the tragedy about to strike. My father was sitting at the dining table, engrossed in a newspaper, and my mother was bustling about, preparing dinner. The atmosphere was warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the pain I had felt all those years. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. My father stood up, a shadow of worry crossing his face as he answered it. The conversation that followed sent a chill down my spine. There was a heated exchange, and I watched in horror as my father's expression darkened. "Please, just give me a moment to think," he pleaded, but the voice on the other side was insistent and threatening. My heart raced as I realized this was the moment that had led to his demise. I wanted to intervene, to warn him, but I was powerless, a mere observer in this tragic unfolding. The door slammed shut, and I saw my father's shoulders slump in defeat. Moments later, the commotion escalated, and I was thrust back into the present, the weight of my father's choices heavy on my heart. As the light faded, I found myself back in the clock tower, the eternal timekeeper still glowing softly. I felt an overwhelming sense of grief, but also a strange understanding. My father hadn't acted out of malice. He was trying to protect us in the best way he could. Tears streamed down my face as I realized that the pain I had carried was rooted in misunderstanding. The clock had given me the gift of perspective, a chance to see the truth that had been hidden from me for so long. With newfound resolve, I carefully placed the eternal timekeeper back in its compartment, sealing the hidden panel. I understood that some moments were meant to remain untouched, but the lessons they taught us were invaluable. As I descended the staircase, I felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I left the clock tower behind, knowing that I would carry the wisdom of my past into the future. In the days that followed, I poured my heart into my craft, creating beautiful timepieces that honored not just the art of watchmaking but also the stories they held. And every tick of the clock reminded me of the importance of time, the moments we cherish and those we learn from, all weaving together the tapestry of our lives. I've always been captivated by the stories of the supernatural. I grew up in the small town of Riverbend, known for its picturesque landscapes and the river that wound its way through the valley. But there was one tale that sent shivers down the spines of the townsfolk, the legend of the Lantern of Riverbend. According to the stories, an old fisherman named Thomas had lived by the river decades ago. He was known for his kindness and generosity, often helping those in need. One stormy night, he ventured out onto the river in search of lost souls, his lantern illuminating the dark waters. But he never returned. Since then, it was said that his spirit roamed the river, guiding lost travelers home with his lantern's glowing light. As a budding journalist, I found the legend too intriguing to resist. One crisp autumn evening, I decided to investigate the riverbank, hoping to uncover the truth behind the tale. Armed with my notebook and a flashlight, I made my way to the river just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was thick with mist, and the river shimmered under the pale moonlight. I sat on a weathered log, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. As I jotted down my thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Suddenly, I noticed a flickering light in the distance, just beyond the bend in the river. My heart raced with excitement and fear. Could it be Thomas's lantern? I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the light, the beam cutting through the darkness. As I approached, I saw that the glowing light was indeed a lantern, suspended in midair. It swayed gently, illuminating the surrounding trees with an ethereal glow. I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, an urge to reach out and touch the light. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone there?" The lantern flickered in response, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and suddenly the light extinguished, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me and I turned to leave, but a voice called out from the shadows. "Jack, stay!" I froze, recognizing the voice. It was deep and resonant, yet filled with warmth. "Who are you?" I asked, trembling. "I am Thomas," the voice replied, and from the darkness emerged a figure, a man in tattered clothes holding the lantern that had just flickered out. His face was kind, but his eyes held a depth of sorrow that made my heart ache. "Why are you here?" I asked, my curiosity battling my fear. "I am bound to this river, eternally searching for lost souls," he said, his voice echoing through the stillness. "I need your help to find my way home." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "How can I help you?" "Listen closely," he said, his expression serious. "The river holds the memories of those I've lost. You must help me uncover their stories or I will be trapped here forever." With a deep breath, I nodded. "I'll help you." Thomas gestured for me to follow him as he led me along the riverbank. The lantern glowed softly in the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. As we walked, he began to share stories of the people he had encountered. Fishermen who had vanished in the night, travelers who had lost their way, and children who had wandered too close to the water's edge. The river whispered their names, the water flowing gently as if echoing the tales of the past. I listened intently, jotting down every detail, every name, feeling the weight of their stories settle within me. As we reached a secluded spot by the river, Thomas paused, his expression pained. "This is where I last saw them. Their spirits are trapped here, lost in the currents of time." I knelt by the water's edge, feeling the coolness of the river as I focused on the stories we had gathered. "What do we do now?" I asked, looking up at him. "Call their names," Thomas urged. "Release their memories into the river and they will find peace." I closed my eyes, centering myself, and began to call out the names I had written down. Henry, Clara, little Billy, come home. The river stirred and I felt a rush of energy surge through me. The water began to shimmer, reflecting the moonlight like 1,000 stars. I continued to call their names, my voice rising above the sound of the flowing water. Suddenly the lantern flickered back to life, shining brighter than before. A warm glow enveloped us, and I felt the presence of the lost souls surrounding us. The current swirled and danced, carrying their stories away into the night. "Thank you, Jack," Thomas said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You freed them. Now I can finally go home." As he spoke, the lantern began to fade, the glow dimming until it was just a flicker in the darkness. "But wait," I called out, feeling a pang of sadness. "What will happen to you?" "I'll be reunited with them," he replied, a serene smile on his face. "You've given me the gift of closure. Remember my story, and continue to share the tales of those who came before." With that, the lantern extinguished completely, and Thomas's figure dissolved into the night. The river flowed steadily, its whispers now calm and gentle. I sat there in silence, the weight of the experience settling in my heart. When I finally returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling of connection I had forged with the river and its lost souls. I poured my heart into writing their stories, ensuring that their memories would never fade. In the weeks that followed, the legend of the Lantern of Riverbend grew richer as I shared my experience with the townsfolk. They listened in awe, their eyes wide with wonder. And though Thomas was gone, his spirit lived on in the stories I told. From that day forward, the river no longer felt like a haunting reminder of loss. It became a sacred place of remembrance, a testament to the lives that had once thrived along its shores. And every time I visited, I could feel the echoes of those souls, the lantern's light guiding me through the darkness, reminding me that every story deserves to be told. My name is Ethan, and I'm a night security guard at the abandoned Oak Ridge Asylum. a decrepit building perched on the outskirts of town. It's infamous for its dark past, rumors of unethical experiments, tortured souls, and ghostly apparitions. I took the job out of desperation for cash, but the eerie atmosphere kept me awake at night, and my imagination ran wild in the silence. It was a chilly October night, and the wind howled outside like a lamenting spirit. I made my rounds, flashlight in hand, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. As I walked through the dimly lit halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Shadows flickered just out of the beam of my flashlight, playing tricks on my mind. I stopped at the old common room, where torn-up chairs were scattered haphazardly. A cracked mirror hung on the wall, its surface clouded with grime. I approached it, wiping it with my sleeve, and peered into its depths. The reflection was distorted, showing not just my face, but something behind me. A flicker of movement. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty, just the echo of my own breath. Shaking off the unease, I returned to the mirror. This time, I leaned closer, scrutinizing my reflection. It was then that I noticed something chilling. The mirror didn't just reflect me. It showed a figure lurking behind me, shrouded in darkness, its features obscured. I turned again, but there was nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt the weight of being watched. "Get a grip, Ethan," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the creeping dread. As the hours dragged on, I continued my patrol, but the feeling of being followed was relentless. I returned to the common room several times, drawn to that mirror and the shadow lurking within it. Each time I looked, it lingered just out of reach, its presence growing stronger, more oppressive. Then came the night when I noticed something different. The figure wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had begun to take shape. I could see its outline, a gaunt face, hollow eyes, and a twisted smile that sent chills down my spine. I staggered back, my heart pounding. "Who are you?" I yelled into the emptiness. "Ethan," it whispered, its voice echoing in my ears like the wind through the asylum's broken windows. "Ethan, let me out." The room grew colder, the air thick with an unnatural energy. I stumbled back to the mirror, heart racing. "What do you want?" I demanded. "Join me in the reflection," it beckoned, its smile widening. I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to step closer. The mirror seemed to shimmer, the figure within becoming more defined. Fear gripped me, but curiosity clawed at my mind. I found myself leaning in, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. "Ethan, it's so lonely here," it whispered again, and I could almost feel its breath on my skin. Suddenly the mirror rippled like water, and before I could react, the figure lunged forward, its hand reaching out. I stumbled back, but not before its fingers grazed my arm. A jolt of cold surged through me, and I felt myself being pulled toward the glass as if the mirror was a portal to another realm. "Help me," I screamed, panic flooding my veins. But as I struggled, the figure's form twisted and morphed, becoming a grotesque reflection of myself, grinning with malice. In a desperate attempt to escape, I broke away from the mirror, stumbling into the hallway. I ran, not looking back, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just encountered. But the asylum was endless, and I could hear its whispers following me, calling my name, urging me to return. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted. I resigned from the job, but the whispers haunted my dreams. Every night I saw that mirror and the twisted reflection, its hollow eyes watching me, waiting for me to return. Months later, unable to escape the memories, I returned to the asylum, determined to confront whatever had taken hold of me. I stood before the common room door, heart pounding, and pushed it open. The air was thick with dust and despair, but I could hear the whispers again, beckoning me closer. I approached the mirror, its surface cloudy as ever, but my reflection was not alone. The figure stood behind me, its face now unmistakably my own. I could see the twisted smile, the hollow eyes filled with dark promises. "Join me," it said, its voice a haunting echo of my own. You've always belonged here." In a moment of clarity, I understood that I was never meant to leave. The asylum was my home, and I had been chosen to join the ranks of the lost souls. As I stepped closer to the mirror, the glass rippled, and I felt a surge of cold envelop me. With one final glance at my own terrified reflection, I stepped into the mirror, the darkness swallowing me whole. The asylum stood silent, the whispers fading into the wind, until the next night when a new guard would come, unaware of the fate that awaited them. And in the depths of the mirror my reflection smiled, ready to welcome the next soul to the darkness. I'm a home renovator specializing in restoring old properties. In October 2023, I was called to a historic mansion on the outskirts of Maplewood, a sprawling estate known as Hawthorne Manor. The townsfolk often spoke of its grandeur, but also of the eerie occurrences that surrounded it. With a reputation for being haunted, I was both excited and apprehensive about taking on the project. As I arrived at the manor, the wind howled through the trees, and the sky was a gray canvas threatening rain. The mansion loomed before me, its once majestic facade now draped in ivy and shadows. I stepped inside, the heavy wooden door creaking as it opened, revealing a world frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that peeked through the grimy windows, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and neglect. I began my work on the first floor, but as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. Whispers floated through the empty halls, and shadows flickered just out of sight. Each time I turned to investigate, I found nothing but silence. I brushed it off as my imagination, fueled by the stories I'd heard. As I progressed with the renovations, I stumbled upon a locked door at the end of a long corridor on the second floor. The door was old and weathered, almost as if it were begging to be opened. Intrigued, I searched for the key, eventually finding it hidden in a loose floorboard nearby. My hands trembled with anticipation as I unlocked the door. It creaked open to reveal a dimly lit room, untouched by time. Dust-covered furniture was draped in white sheets, and a large, ornate mirror stood against one wall. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as I stepped inside. As I moved closer to the mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection. Something was lurking just beyond the edges of the glass. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the quiet. No response. I shook off the chill creeping up my spine and began to explore the room. Old photographs adorned the walls, capturing moments from a family's life long gone. Among the images, one caught my eye, a young girl with dark curls and striking green eyes, standing in front of the very mirror that now loomed before me. Suddenly I felt a presence behind me, a chill brushing against my neck. I turned, but the room was empty. My heart raced, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I returned to the mirror, peering into its depths, and this time I saw her, the girl from the photograph, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Panic surged through me as I stumbled back. "What do you want?" I cried, but she only pointed toward the mirror, tears glistening in her eyes. Determined to uncover the truth, I began to investigate the room more thoroughly. Buried beneath the dust of the floorboards, I found a small diary. Flipping through its pages, I discovered it belonged to the girl. Her name was Lily Hawthorne. The entries detailed her life in the manor, the love she had for her family, and the darkness that had crept into their lives. The final entry sent shivers down my spine. "I can hear them whispering. They want me to stay. I just want to go home." A chill swept through the room, and I could feel the temperature drop. I glanced back at the mirror, and Lily's reflection was now frantic, her eyes pleading. "You have to help me," she cried. "I'm trapped in the mirror." The air crackled with tension as the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. I felt a compulsion to reach out to the mirror. "What can I do?" I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. "Break the curse. You must find the truth about my family," she urged, her image flickering like a candle in the wind. With no time to lose, I hurried to gather more information about the Hawthorne family, my mind racing with possibilities. As I delved into the mansion's history, I learned of a tragic event that had taken place decades ago. The family had fallen victim to a dark curse that kept them bound to the manor, their souls trapped within its walls. Lily had been the last to succumb, her spirit forever tied to the mirror. I returned to the room, adrenaline coursing through me. "I know what happened, Lily. I will help you," I shouted into the mirror. "I'll break the curse." But as I spoke, the shadows in the room began to swirl violently, and I felt a presence closing in around me. "Leave," a deep, menacing voice boomed from the depths of the mirror. "You will not disturb the peace we have maintained for so long." The room shook, and I stumbled back, fear gripping my heart. "No, I won't let you keep her," I shouted defiantly, feeling a surge of courage. I grabbed the diary and began to read aloud from Lily's entries, recounting her joys and fears, her love for her family, and her desire for freedom. As I spoke, the shadows writhed and twisted, and I could see Lily's reflection growing stronger. "Keep going," she urged, her voice resonating within me. "You're breaking the spell." With every word, the energy in the room shifted, and the mirror began to crack, light spilling through the fractures. The oppressive force that had held the room captive started to weaken, the whispers turning into cries of rage. "No!" the voice roared, but I pressed on, determined to free Lily. Finally, with one last shout, I finished the final entry of the diary, and the mirror shattered into a million pieces. Light flooded the room, and as the shards fell to the ground, I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. I turned to see Lily standing before me, her form solid and radiant. "Thank you," she whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You've set me free." In that moment, the air lightened and the shadows receded, leaving the room bathed in a serene glow. I watched as Lily took a step toward the light that had emerged from the shattered mirror, her spirit finally at peace. As she vanished, I felt a profound sense of relief and loss. The curse had been broken, and the Hawthorne family could finally rest. I stood alone in the room, surrounded by the remnants of the past, knowing that I had not only saved Lily but had also uncovered the dark history that had bound her to the manor for so long. But as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had not been vanquished entirely. A subtle whisper lingered in the air, a reminder that some stories are never truly over and that the echoes of the past may still linger within the walls of Hawthorne Manor.